LoveLore Library. Chapter 229. Lady Ty's silence gave Butler Jean a bad premonition. The 7 major families of the Federation had been able to survive for so many years, so they naturally had many ways to control their huge industries and connections. However, every family had loyal subordinates who had served the main family for generations. The Ty family had ruled the empire, so there were even more loyal subordinates who did not reveal themselves. He was one of them. This old butler, who had first served the madam, then Ty's Yuan, liked Su Lo, but he knew that Su Li's true identity would bring great harm to the Ty family's interests, as well as the madam. Most importantly, the information this young man had hidden after escaping to the capital ring was too terrifying. Therefore, after a moment of silence, he spoke first. Even if we can help Su Lo cover up, with his current development in the Federation, there will be a day when many people will notice him. Furthermore, he has exposed too many flaws, so the government will easily catch him. After saying this, he took out a piece of paper and placed it on the stone table. Then, he quietly stepped back and waited for the madam's decision. Lady Ty picked up the thin piece of paper with her fingertips. With her sharp eyes, it did not take long for her to discover the problem with the amount of money recorded on the paper. Lady Ty looked at the thin piece of paper quietly. The paper recorded the flow of millions of dollars. For the master and servant in the scene, this sum of money was not worth a second glance. However, this sum of money came from Su Li's 3 Forest Alliance bank card. In the end, it was transferred through the channels of the Federation's black market to an account in the Eastern Forest region. This was enough to prove a very serious problem. Although nostalgia is a very respectable emotion, it is also a very idiotic thing to do, especially when you don't have the ability to do so. Lady Ty stood up and returned the paper to Butler Jean. She said calmly, "That person called Li Wei was Su Li's friend in Eastern Forest." Yes. When this amount of money was transferred, that Li Wei had just been released from prison. The first person who saw a crab would definitely be frightened by such an ugly creature, but the second person who saw a crab would definitely not be so shocked. Lady Ty knew where Butler Jin's fear came from. She also knew what the chip on the back of Su Li's neck meant to the Federation. However, she had seen it before, so she was able to conceal her emotions perfectly. With her hand still resting quietly on her lap, Lady Ty narrowed her eyes and looked at the East Sea in front of her. It should be summer in S1, autumn in S2, and spring in S3. The green hills behind her were filled with wildflowers, and the beach in front of her had some plants growing stubbornly. At this moment, Madame Jean was reminded of many things, especially because of Butler Jin's solemn tone. She was reminded of the meeting that happened many years ago. That was in S1's capital special district. The president of that era and the director of the Bureau of Proclamation jointly invited her, her husband, and the god of war, Lees of Philadelphia, into a small room. During that closed-door meeting, the president and the director's words and tone were very similar to what Butler Jean said in the temple today. The abnormal situation that the Federal Central Computer found shocked everyone present. After that intense argument, Tai Yuan's father, her husband, left in anger. The head of the Tai family, who created the romantic plot of the Double Moon Festival, was a good person full of humanity. No matter how one thought about it, he couldn't make that kind of decision because it would definitely betray and hurt his friends. However, everyone in that room knew that if they couldn't control that person, with that person's temperament, the books that he wrote, and the things that he did, the glory of the charter would one day dim, and the political system of the Federation would start to falter. Once the first charter lost its effect, the people would start to look at those politicians and big families with hatred. The human federation, which spanned hundreds of light years, would definitely fall apart. Every district and every administrative planet would become independent, and civil war would ensue in the Federation. When that time came, what kind of hell would the Federation become? There was also the imperial armies, who were already showing their sharp teeth at that time. If they were allowed to control that man's mind, would the Federation forever become a colony of those barbarians? Therefore, when the head of the Tai family left in anger, Madame Tai stayed behind. This was because from the first day she married into the Tai family, she had knelt in front of her parents-in-law and swore that she would definitely help her husband to continue the Tai family, so that the Federation could exist peacefully in the universe forever. That military god from the Lees of Philadelphia also signed his name after a long period of silence. Unfortunately, the later changes in the situation were more or less out of the expectations of these two people. His Excellency the President initially wanted to control, but that man who had thousands of incarnations didn't want to be controlled at all. In fact, he couldn't control him at all. Only the heavens knew how the Lees of Philadelphia gave birth to these two monsters, who actually had such powerful abilities. The Federation government and the Bureau of Proclamation's secret pursuit, because of that man's tenacious resistance towards freedom, evolved into a pursuit that spanned many years and many galaxies. During this process, who knew how many Federation soldiers died, and how many news events shocked the Federation? The sea breeze mixed with the mountain breeze, slightly salty and cool, brushing past the stone platform in front of the temple. Madame Tai woke up from her memories. She actually felt a bit cold, subconsciously shrinking her body. She actually felt a bit disappointed about the decision she made back then. Back then, there were only 5 people who participated in that closed-door meeting. It just so happened to be the same number of people as the group of 5 that led humanity out of the darkness after the catastrophe countless years ago. The contents of that meeting were only known to these 5 people. Even if the other great families of the Federation's 7 great families vaguely found out some things, they still had no way of coming into contact with the truth. His Excellency the President, with the help of Li Pifu of Philadelphia, ultimately led the entire Federation to defeat the barbaric invasion of the Imperial armies. Then, he passed away from illness amidst the cheers of tens of billions of Federation citizens and the sounds of fireworks by the windows. At the time, Madame Tai was at His Excellency the President's side. Even today, she still believed that His Excellency the President of that time was the most outstanding politician in the history of the Federation. After the war ended, that figure who was revered as a military god by the people also returned to the lakeside of the Lees of Philadelphia to retire. The federal military and the people always thought that this person didn't want his lofty prestige to affect the normal operations of the Federation's political system. Therefore, they revered him even more. However, this was actually only a part of the reason. In the Federation, only Madame Tai knew that this military god must have felt sad and guilty that he had personally sent his brother into that huge explosion. Such sadness could only be soothed by returning to his hometown by the lakeside. The reason why she knew was because she also felt the same way. Madame Tai narrowed her eyes and looked at the surface of the sea. However, the hands in her sleeves gently clenched. She thought of that huge explosion in the Donglin region 2 years ago. It wasn't until the Federal Central Computer once again discovered that man's existence through an electric baton that these important figures who had felt sad and guilty for many years, finally realized that everything was fake. That huge explosion on the Empire's resource planet didn't kill him at all. That's right, Professor Jean, Mechanic Yufeng, George Carlin, these people who had countless incarnations and walked the universe with their own abilities, how could they die so easily? Every time Madame Tai thought of her husband's incomprehension, anger, and indifference towards her after that huge explosion more than 10 years ago, she would feel better until he died. However, that man hid on that desolate mineral planet as if nothing had happened, drinking small amounts of alcohol, smoking small amounts of cigarettes, raising his disciple, and visiting prostitutes at the sanatorium punctually every week. Madame Tai was furious. Her respectable husband did so much for that so-called friend, but that person was so heartless and only cared about his own happiness. When it came to being heartless, as expected, no one was more ruthless than him. "I hope you're really dead this time," Madame Tai said in an extremely cold tone. The ancient bell that was secretly controlled by the 4th Military Region was originally a modified battleship. Although the power of the main cannon wasn't necessarily more powerful than that of the huge explosion more than 10 years ago, it was more concentrated. Furthermore, the person who personally took action at the front line was a powerful figure like Fatty Tian. Logically speaking, that man shouldn't be able to survive. However, the problem was that she had seen that man create too many miracles with her own eyes, so she wasn't so sure. Butler Jean had been standing behind her silently, waiting for orders. Madame Tai stood up and gently adjusted her cuffs. She said slowly, "This matter can't be known to anyone else. Recall all the personnel in charge of the investigation. Also, send someone to monitor that person called Li Wei and find a suitable way to bring him to Bermuda." Butler Jin's body trembled. From these few orders, he knew that Madame Tai definitely didn't intend to tell the government about Su Li's true identity. He didn't expect Madame Tai to make such a decision and was momentarily stunned. Madame Tai didn't care about the shock in his heart. She raised her head slightly and allowed the cold sea breeze to blow away the blazing sun on her linen clothes. She thought silently in her heart, "If you're still alive, I'll use Su Lo to lure you out. Let's see if you're really so heartless that you don't care about anyone. If you're really dead 2 years ago, I'll try to control your student. Many years ago, we failed. I really want to know if we'll succeed this time. If we don't, I'll send him to the Netherworld Sea to accompany you." The most powerful madam in the Federation smiled as she looked at the blue sea that was getting darker as the sun moved westward. She stood up and walked towards the old temple. Butler Jean bowed slightly to send her off. His heart felt extremely heavy because of Madame Tai's decision. However, that old temple wasn't a place he could set foot in, so he couldn't persuade her even if he wanted to. He just felt that Madame Tai might have made a huge mistake this time. Su Lo didn't know that on a planet several light years away, there was a conversation about him happening. He also didn't know that Madame Tai had already found out his true identity and had decided to use him to lure out that heartless uncle, or to completely control him in her hands. If it was the former, then there would definitely be schemes and dangers. If it was the latter, then there would definitely be methods and pressure, until he completely lost his freedom. Freedom was the most basic requirement that every person had outside of survival. In short, a crisis was slowly approaching this fugitive's body, but he didn't know anything about it. Right now, he was even lamenting the power of the Tai family hidden within the Federation. He completely didn't know that the more powerful Madame Tai was, the more difficult his life in the universe would be in the future. His cooperation with the Tai family had been very pleasant. After just a trip to the Nutshell Engineering Department, the other party had given him enough authority to even send a military mecha to Whitewater Company in such a short period of time. Even if it was one of the 7 great families of the Federation, it was still a little shocking that they could do all this. What made Su Lo even more shocked was that the Tai family could influence the Nutshell Engineering Department, and even tamper with Whitewater Company to get that CEO to cooperate. This kind of influence was really frightening. He even wondered, was the Shell Motor Company part of the Federation or the Tai family? This was his emotional reaction when he saw the M37 just now. Right now, Su Lo couldn't care less about these things. He was currently standing with several logistics personnel at the control panel behind the super strong glass. Looking at the silhouette of the black mecha in the mecha room, he clenched his fists tightly from time to time, feeling a little nervous and excited. The black M37 mecha was moving quickly in the spacious mecha room. The old-style single engine was at full power, letting out a low humming sound. However, these sounds seemed to be unable to keep up with the black mecha's own high-speed movements. Although the mecha room was spacious, it still seemed a little small for a 6-meter-tall military mecha to move quickly and evade in there. However, the black mecha was being operated smoothly like flowing water. Every action was simple, fast, accurate, and effective. There were absolutely no redundant commands. When it was evading, there was no obvious deceleration, and there were no scenes of it crashing into obstacles. Only the most excellent pilots could operate such a heavy mecha and still make such smooth reactions at this speed. The electronic data collection devices on the ceiling of the mecha room were working non-stop, faithfully transmitting the control data of the black mecha back to the control panel. Those staff members looked at the data nervously and couldn't help but exclaim softly in shock. After this M37 had started moving, it had never stopped. The 7-minute-long test of evading and speed had been completed in one go, as awe-inspiring as the rushing of a river. And those feedback data proved just how terrifyingly fast the hand speed of the pilot in the mecha had reached in this period of time. Even someone like Sulu, who had not been in contact with mecha operations for long, could see the pilot's extremely talented control ability and that trace of awe-inspiring beauty in the black mecha's clean and efficient movements. With a soft beep, the black M37 instantly turned from extreme motion to extreme stillness. The power of the 3 engines was retracted, and the mechanical legs stood firmly in the center of the circle. The entire body of the mecha did not tremble at all, ending the entire test with an extremely perfect standard tactical movement. With the sound of compressed air being released, the cabin door of the black M37 opened. A delicate man jumped out of the mecha, tucking his hands into his trousers out of habit, ignoring the drop of sweat dripping from his hair. Chapter 230. The self-maintenance equipment silently drove into the spacious mecha battle room, making a soft beeping sound. Underneath the smooth and sturdy floor, a few probes extended from the center of the circle and connected to the black M37 mecha's abdomen port. They began testing the control computer and removing redundancy. Everything appeared to be very organized and orderly. However, the control panel was already bustling with activity. Looking at the handsome man gradually approaching, the logistics technicians of the Whitewater Company's underground base began to clap and stomp their feet. Some even whistled. They had seen too many mecha tests in their lives and were already numb to it. However, today, this secretary of Team 7 had given them a big surprise. The data that the black mecha had sent back earlier was very shocking. A pilot with such control ability would definitely be an ace pilot in the Federal Army. Of course, as the federal military's biggest secret contractor, Whitewater Company had also had its ace pilots come here to carry out missions under different identities. However, these high and mighty pilots would not stay in the base for long. Often, after completing their missions, they would return to the army. They had not even come to Whitewater Company's headquarters. "Do you want to take a shower first?" Sula walked down from the control panel and looked at by Magnolia, who had her head lowered. This man always had his head lowered out of habit. Perhaps it was to hide his overly delicate features, or perhaps he did not want to see anything. "I didn't sweat too much," by Magnolia replied softly. The whistling on the control panel continued. Sulu turned back and smiled. He asked, "Does it feel like this in the army too?" By Magnolia was silent for a moment before saying, "It's even more exaggerated than this." Sulu had seen with his own eyes how Bai Yulan operated the M37 mecha as smoothly as flowing water. Although there had not been any actual combat practice, he knew that this delicate man was definitely very impressive. Otherwise, the Federation military would not have given the task of testing the latest model of the MX mecha to Team 7. The problem was that even though Team 7 had become one of the scapegoats for the failure of the MX experiment, the other combat members of the team had all been transferred back to their original units. They were either grounded or on vacation. Only Magnolia remained at the Whitewater Company. How could the federal military forget such an outstanding pilot? As the two of them walked out of the base, Sulu suddenly asked, "What unit were you originally in?" "Special Mecha Battalion of the 17th Armored Division of the 1st Military Region." Bai Yulan knew what his question was. She said indifferently, 3 years ago, my class was on a mission at the outskirts of Bermuda. We encountered the 1st Mecha Battalion of the Empire's Royal Special Forces. Everyone was annihilated. I was the only one who escaped back to the rescue ship." Although his words were calm and natural, Sulu could hear a trace of unwillingness and pain in his words. After the end of the war more than 10 years ago, the Federation and the Empire maintained peace on the surface. However, in reality, both sides were still constantly probing each other in the intersecting star fields. Sporadic conflicts and casualties had never stopped. The 4th Military Region was stationed at the space passage to the Magellanic Nebula in the West Woods region. It was a place that both the Federation and the Empire had to fight over. These past few years, wars had been ongoing on those resource planets and even barren planets. Meanwhile, the Bermuda Triangle star field was the best place for both sides to test each other's military strength. I was the class monitor. Originally, I should have been court-martialed. However, my original commanding officer pleaded for me, so I was sent to the Whitewater Company. I've been there for a few years now. My personality is a bit strange. I've killed too many people and I like money too much. That's why no one likes me." After briefly explaining her origins and background for the first time, Bai Yulan never talked about herself in front of Sulu again. This habit lasted for a long time. The two of them walked out of the underground base and followed the self-propelled caterpillar to the platform on the side of the Whitewater Company building. It was almost evening. The sun of the S1 system was moving in the opposite direction. The bright red light shone in the sky above the large Federation farm next to the Whitewater Company, turning the green vegetables into burning flames. Sulu lit his lighter and put his cigarette near the flame. He did not give Bai Yulan a cigarette because he knew that she would not smoke. He looked at Bai Yulan's thin body leaning against the wall of the platform from the corner of his eye. He felt a little strange. Such a surprisingly calm, girl-like man could make that heavy M37 as fierce and agile as a cheetah once he entered the mech. "Can you teach me how to operate a mech?" Sulu took a puff of his cigarette and asked casually, as if he had suddenly thought of this matter. By now, his understanding of mecha was already extremely deep. In Yue University, he had done countless practice runs and even sparred with Tai Yuan many times. But today, after witnessing Bai Yulan's mecha with his own eyes, he finally knew how big the gap was between him and Tai Yuan. The key was not the movements, but the fluidity of the black M37's evasive maneuvers. Sulu believed that without using the simulation system, if Bai Yulan were to engage in a mech battle with him, she would only need 2 rounds to successfully use the mech speed to break through his mech's defenses and knock him out. With your understanding of mecha structure, it won't be difficult for you to master a mech. Bai Yulan was not surprised that Sulu would make such a request. He leaned against the wall of the platform and looked at the vegetable garden outside. He said softly, "The military mecha I usually operate have joysticks. The joysticks are used to simplify commands and directly control the direction of the mech's movement. Below the joysticks are 17 sensitive buttons. They have the same function, but they are basically used to control the firepower system. The prototypes you've worked with before did not have such a setup, so you need to first familiarize yourself with these components. After familiarizing yourself with them, you need to familiarize yourself with the standard military movements. For example, the set of movements I used to test the M37 just now is the tip of the triangular assault formation." Sulu asked curiously, "I've heard of this before, but I don't think I've ever heard of a defensive formation." The greatest advantage of a mech in modern warfare is its mobility. Although the alloy armor's bullet resistance is already very high, it is still unable to withstand the concentrated attacks of heavy firepower. So the key is to touch and leave. Touch and leave was clearly a jargon used by the Federal Army. Sulu did not quite understand. It means to sneakily touch a girl's butt and run away before her boyfriend can react. Such a vivid metaphor, that's really rare. Yes, this saying was passed down from the Special Forces of the 4th Military Region. Because of the image, everyone remembers it. Bai Yulan lowered her head and said, "The characteristics of a mech lie in these aspects. It is a terrifying fighting machine that is born to be used for assault. If it is used for defense, that would be a huge waste. It would be better to stack up a few dozen heavy armored vehicles. The Special Forces of the Federal Army do not have the bad habit of playing defense." The delicate-looking man continued in a slightly mocking tone, "In this universe, only the Empire would design a special mech defensive formation. That's because those are the royal mechs, to ensure the safety of those noble princesses and princes." Sulu shrugged his shoulders. Apart from seeing the Empire's diplomats on TV and those captives who swore to be enemies with the Empire, he really didn't have any direct knowledge of that distant enemy country. However, after hearing Bai Yulan's words, he couldn't help but imagine such an embarrassing scene in his mind, and he couldn't help but laugh. Bai Yulan suddenly stared at his face and said seriously, "Of course, if you can help the Federation make the MX, the maneuverability at 4 times the normal power output is frightening beyond imagination. A mech like this can be thrown into a direct battle. Even if it is surrounded by an entire Empire armored battalion, there is still a possibility of breaking through. The MX is a completely new generation of mecha. This will require the military pilots to adapt and even research new battle strategies to be able to bring out the full potential of the MX's maneuverability. This will take a very long time. From the time the new mech is developed to the time it is equipped, the military will need at least 1.5 years to get used to it." After a moment of silence, Sulu opened his mouth to ask, "Are you ready?" Bai Yulan's head was still lowered, but his delicate-looking eyes were narrowed. From the last trip to Hong Kong, he already knew what Sulu had arranged for him to do. However, no matter which angle he looked at it from, he could not resist this temptation. "You will be the Federation's first pilot for the MX mecha." Sulu looked at him and said. After all, Bai Yulan had once operated a dual-engine mecha, so he had a natural advantage in this aspect. Moreover, Sulu could not allow the secret of his ability to use the simulation system to operate mecha to be exposed. Thus, this delicate-looking man in front of him was his best choice. "I've been preparing for this." Bai Yulan raised his head and smiled faintly. "Sometimes when I think about it, I should be the one giving you 20 million. To be the new generation's chief pilot for the MX mecha was bound to be a great honor, which was why Bai Yulan had said so." Sulu only noticed the other's smile. For the first time, he found that Secretary Bai could also shine brightly under the sun. "I've operated mecha before, but I always felt that when you were operating the M37 earlier, the mecha's movements seemed to have some sort of rhythm. After operating for a long time, I'm familiar with it. I've memorized all the standard combinations. Every mecha will be imprinted with the pilot's personal habits and movements. We usually call this the mecha style. Mad Manly, you should know what style his mecha is." Sulu suddenly asked with a frown. Bai Yulan looked at him quietly and said seriously, "1 year, I once saw him in the West Woods. He opened wide and closed wide, crazy as could be. Probably only the old war god could raise such a grandson. I know that your individual combat ability is very strong, so strong that you don't fear him. But I'm warning you, if Mad Manly is in a mecha, you'd better stay away, even if you're operating the MX." Chapter 231. What's the style of the mecha you operate? Su asked curiously as he finished the last puff of his cigarette. No style. Bai Yuan leaned against the wall of the platform and replied softly, maybe it's just more accurate. Su shrugged. Although he was not satisfied with this answer, there was nothing he could do. A true ace mecha pilot's battle style could only be displayed on a real battlefield. It was indeed difficult to describe it with words. He was just a little curious, when this young lady Bai Yuan truly operated her mecha to the extreme, would she also have the same tranquil, elegant, and natural look as if she was grooming herself in front of a mirror? As the sun continued to set, the Federation's farm on the other side of the courtyard wall also began to quietly shake off the sea of fire. It became a quiet green oil painting, gradually dimming until it was almost impossible to see clearly. Su took a set of car keys from Bai Yuan's hands. Carrying the heavy black leather suitcase, he hurriedly left Whitewater Company and headed straight for the place he had agreed to meet with Secretary Shin. It was a very ordinary fast food restaurant. Su sent the file hidden in the workbench to Secretary Shin's portable computer. Frowning, he said, in the past, I had an agreement with Tai Yuan. He promised me that he would do his best to prevent that person from being elected as the Federation's vice president. But that fellow disappeared without a trace. I don't know where he went. You don't have to say anything. I won't ask you. It's just that since he ran away so irresponsibly, I have to do something. The things in this file should be of some use to you. I hope you can use them well. Secretary Shin gently stirred the instant coffee in front of him. He smiled silently, but his mood was a little strange. He did not know that the Crown Prince had actually made such an agreement with Su before. He raised his head and very sharply sensed that Su was looking at something out of the corner of his eye. His smile deepened, and he said, "You don't have to look for him. When I go out to do things, I don't have the habit of bringing people with me." Su was indeed looking for Secretary Shin's bodyguard. Shinli was now Lady Tai's chief secretary. He stood at the front desk and was in charge of handling the communications between the Tai family and the outside world. Tai Yuan had gone to S2 and remained silent. From a certain perspective, Secretary Shin was equivalent to the Tai family spokesperson in the Federation. His safety was naturally of the utmost importance to the Tai family. Hearing Shinli's explanation, Su smiled and began to focus on destroying the 4 pieces of bread on the plate in front of him. He did not have the habit of bringing people with him. On one hand, it showed that he was like Shi Qinghai, a person who came from the First Academy and was extremely confident in his abilities. On the other hand, since the entire Federation knew that Secretary Shin was the representative of the Tai family, who would dare to provoke him? The Tai family had only one son for 7 generations. Perhaps there would be some daring people who dared to plot against Tai Yuan's life and death. However, if they wanted to kill Secretary Shin, other than angering the Tai family, there would be no benefits. Although Secretary Shin's explanation was simple, it was filled with endless confidence in the terrifying abilities of the Tai family. Su chewed on the bread and couldn't help but feel a little shaken. This was probably the magnanimity that came from having power. Secretary Shin didn't know that his words had caused Su to think so much. He was just a little surprised at this young man's appetite. Su had already eaten 4 pieces of bread and drank 3 cups of soy milk, but Su still didn't seem to have any intention of stopping. Su lowered his head and tore the bread into a few pieces. He felt that someone was staring at him. With the bread crumbs in his mouth, he vaguely explained, "I get hungry easily, especially after working." In just a few minutes' time, Su had memorized the positions and functions of the 17 sensitive touch buttons on the control stick. Not long after that, he had familiarized himself with the control stick's method of borrowing data and commands. His left hand began to operate the mecha smoothly. After all, he had been immersed in the design of mecha since he was young. In the past 2 years, he had conducted serious, even obsessive, research on the Federation's M-series mecha. It was not difficult for him to familiarize himself with the control methods of military mecha. His left hand controlled the control stick, while his right hand slid along the ergonomic sliding slot on the touchscreen. Through the helmet that covered most of his face, the rapidly scrolling analysis images appeared on the screen before his eyes. The infrared sensors and vision of the M37 mecha's head were accurately transmitted to Su Li's eyes. Su Li took a deep breath and pushed the control stick slightly. The 5 fingers of his right hand moved as fast as lightning as he entered several data commands on the touchscreen. In the airtight control room, he could not hear the powerful roar of the engine at the back of the mecha's waist. However, he could clearly feel a large propulsive force penetrating his body from the attachment pad below his buttocks. It was just like the feeling of riding a space shuttle from the ground into outer space. However, this propulsive force was much more ferocious, and the vibrations were so great that the average person would find it hard to bear. Su Li was no stranger to this feeling. In Area H1 of Yue University, he had once operated the M-series prototype mecha to perform many Level 6 mecha tests. He had also sparred with Tai Zhuan many times. Thus, after more than half a year, he only needed a few seconds to get used to this feeling, and even vaguely fall in love with it. The black M37 mecha began to operate at high speed. Wearing his helmet, Su Li narrowed his eyes, enjoying the thrill of the mecha's large-scale leaps. Being inside the alloy mecha, he could not feel the wind blowing against his face, so there was not much of a sense of high speed. However, the intense vibrations and the additional pale green images in the helmet's vision compared to the real world, those images that flashed by quickly allowed Su Li to easily capture the feeling of mechanical power and human will merging into one. This was probably a kind of awe-inspiring feeling that could destroy and protect everything. Perhaps calling it awe-inspiring was not the right word. Su Li stared at the data feeds on the pale green image, and through the control stick and the data commands in his right hand, he quickly adjusted the mecha's evasive posture, rotation, and leaps. He did not close his eyes, but his mind wandered a little. He thought of a work on aesthetics that the uncle had forced him to read at Heshi State University. In that work, one of the Federation's most famous aesthetics experts in the 17th constitutional era had put forward an argument that the ultimate, most soul-stirring beauty in the world was silence. That was silence. Although the teleportation of a human mecha was incomparably fast, and its maneuverability in a small space was extremely strong, due to the solemnity of the mecha's metallic nature, when compared to the relative stillness of the pilot in the cockpit, it could create a kind of serene beauty. Perhaps this was somewhat contradictory, but it was also so natural. One person operating a heavy mecha up to 6 meters tall, feeling the faint presence of machinery and electrical elements in the cockpit. All around him, there was only the faint static from the listening devices and the heavy footsteps of the mecha coming from the cockpit. There was extreme stillness within extreme movement. Su Li suddenly had an illusion. Controlling the mecha, as long as he was calm, he would be a black reef in the ocean, and as long as he moved, he would be a violent meteor streaking through the atmosphere, able to burn a scorched scar into the blue sky at any time. His heart skipped a beat, and he could no longer control the desire in his heart. Tossing aside all the standard federal military movements in his mind, his left hand turned the control stick abruptly, and his right hand swept across the touch screen. Within 1 second, he had entered 4 data commands in succession, and the engine behind the M37 mecha's waist abruptly reversed. "You're crazy. Don't do this kind of action." An extremely furious voice suddenly rang out from within the helmet. Usually, the owner of that voice was used to speaking softly, but at this moment, he was actually so angry. Su Li was slightly taken aback, but he was already unable to stop the M37 mecha from kicking up its right mechanical leg after a sudden turn of the body. The heavy body of the mecha instantly flew upwards, drawing a beautiful line in the air, Bai Yulan held a cup of tea, silently observing the activity in the mecha combat room. However, his heart was not as calm as he appeared on the surface. Su Lu had tossed him 20 million so casually, so he was already prepared to risk his life. However, the more he interacted with this seemingly ordinary young man, the more he felt that the other was not ordinary. At least, he was very sure that if he did not have a gun by his side, he would definitely not be willing to engage in close combat with Su Lu. Since that was the case, how could he risk his life? What surprised him even more was Su Li's current performance in operating the mecha. He had never imagined that someone who had only come into contact with military-use mecha for the first time would actually be able to operate the mecha to such an extent in such a short period of time. He knew that Su Lu was a freak, a genius in the field of mecha repair. He had also come into contact with prototype mecha at Lihua University, but he still could not understand how Su Lu had managed to do this. Although the movements of the M37 in the mecha combat room were somewhat sluggish and stiff, from the feedback of the data, the quality of Su Li's execution of the standard military movements was not bad, and his evasive response was shockingly high. This kind of performance was too shocking, unless Su Lu was a naturally thick-skinned person who had no fear of the unknown. Bai Yulan did not know that Su Li's reaction when operating the mecha was basically through the heat flow in his body. His nerves were indeed thicker than the average person's. Bai Yulan was very satisfied, even a little surprised by the first performance of the M37. Holding his teacup, he thought to himself, this freak Su Lu now only lacks familiarity with the mecha, and the experience cultivated through countless real battles. Of course, experience was also the most important thing. Just like driving a car, a newbie could still drive a car on the road. A thick-skinned newbie like Su Lu could even drive a car at 200 km per hour, but he could not be like a real racing driver, who could still perfectly avoid obstacles and protect himself at high speeds. If he could go to the front lines and train for 6 or 7 years, he might really be able to pilot a mecha and go up against Mad Manly. As Bai Yulan thought this, he noticed from the corner of his eye that the high-speed M37 mecha was performing an extremely difficult extreme braking maneuver on the slippery ground. He abruptly raised his head. The sturdy alloy mecha's mechanical legs had tracks attached to them in combat mode, and the alloy toes were used to grip the ground. When braking at high speeds, this maneuver could be completed by relying on the power of the engine, but the heavy weight of the mecha's cockpit could not be absorbed by the mecha's automatic deformation. It basically had to be placed entirely on the pilot's body. The heavy mecha's brakes created a long trail of sparks and smoke on the slippery, hard floor. Bai Yulan's eyes narrowed, not understanding why Su Lu had suddenly performed such a maneuver. Then, he noticed that after the heavy impact, the black mecha's body had sunk slightly, but its right mechanical leg had been raised. Mecha combat technique. A suicidal jump attack. Bai Yulan stood up abruptly and shouted into the communicator, "You're crazy." Chapter 232. After these 3 words, Bai Yulan had wanted to say a few more, but then she stopped abruptly. Because she had already seen that the black M37 had already leapt off the ground amidst a piercing whistle. Following a powerful kick from its right mechanical leg, the mecha, which had released all of its power in an instant after its descent, came to an abrupt halt. In mid-air of the spacious mecha combat room, the entire mecha hung upside down, swiftly drawing an arc in the air. The high-speed friction between the surface of the mecha and the air intensified, and the whistle became even more shrill. The black mecha seemed to have come to a halt in mid-air, abruptly ending its upside-down action. Amidst a series of loud metallic noises, the mecha began to fall rapidly towards the ground. However, in that very short period of time, the mecha, which had clearly been on the verge of losing its balance, seemed to have been injected with power once more. It forcefully twisted its waist and abdomen, separating the 2 mechanical legs in front and back, and stood firmly on the solid ground. With two muffled clangs, the thick mechanical legs of the black M37 bore the brunt of the tremendous force, stomping two small deformed pits into the solid metal floor of the combat room. Meanwhile, the mechanical legs of the mecha also began to tremble, as if it could topple over at any moment, but it did not topple over. Forcefully maintaining its balance, the engine continued to pump out power, allowing the mecha to continuously perform fine maneuvers and adjustments under this precarious situation. In the end, it successfully completed this rough landing. Amidst the hissing sounds of hydraulic transmissions, the black mecha slowly descended about 20 centimeters. All the important metal joints were readjusted, and the engine slowly reduced its output power, no longer moving. The two mechanical legs were one in front and one behind, but the mechanical arms were extended in mid-air to help balance the mecha. In this movement, the massive mecha seemed so quiet and powerful. Bai Yulan stared silently at the motionless mecha under the control panel. Her rapidly beating heart gradually calmed down, but her eyes narrowed slightly. From this black M37, she had actually found a sense of serenity. This was of course not a standard military mecha combat move. In the federal military textbooks, there had never been a case of jumping into mid-air to court death like this. The mobility of a military mecha which weighed up to several tens of tons relied on its powerful engine, as well as the massive reaction force provided by the planet's surface. Just like the slogan of the first military academy's mecha department, mecha cannot exist in a castle in the sky. Mecha must be grounded. The act of leaping in mid-air was a move that every fighter pilot in the military had to master. However, the violent mid-air somersault like the black M37 just now was a test of the pilot's control in the instant before landing. This was because as the mech itself rotated at high speeds, the automatic balancing system used to stabilize the mech would experience a short period of data loss. This was especially true for the black M37's additional action of the mid-air leg splits. The calculations and command output required at the last moment were unimaginably difficult. Don't do this again. If you were in the army, you would have been grounded by your superiors. Bai Yulan said quietly into the communication device. He had concealed the shock in his heart very well. Although he thought that Su Lu was a freak, he still believed that this guy was just lucky to be able to land the M37 safely. The mechanical legs of a fighter mecha are mainly used for evasion and movement, but the attack method is focused on the upper body's firepower system and combat skills. Although because of the simulation of operations, humans are still the most suitable to pilot humanoid mecha, but a mecha is not a human body. If you still have to make lower body movements at high speeds, you will only fall very badly, Bai Yulan said seriously into the communication device in an indifferent tone. In the cockpit of the black M37 below the control panel, Su Lu listened to the sound from the helmet and was silent for a long time. Then, he took off the helmet and carelessly rubbed his hair that was completely wet. He himself did not know why he had done that action just now. It was indeed completely against the requirements of the military's teaching materials, but he had the urge to do it, and he had done it. However, listening to the data analysis of the onboard computer and Bai Yulan's warning, he felt a faint lingering fear in his heart. In that last moment before landing, there had indeed been some danger. If it had not been for the warm current in his body converting his will into data input between his fingers at the fastest speed possible, the M37 beneath him might have really slammed into the ground. Based on the speed at which it had been traveling, the M37 would have been heavily damaged, and he would have been injured as well. Due to the excessive power output of the engine at the very last second, the mecha had automatically shut down some energy-consuming functions, so the temperature in the cockpit was somewhat stuffy. Su Lu exhaled softly, wiping away the beads of sweat that had trickled down his chin. Suddenly, he thought, just how fast was his hand speed at the very last second? Only those idiots who think of themselves as geniuses would do such dangerous and useless actions. Bai Yulan held a teacup and looked at Su Lu, who had just finished showering beside her. She said calmly, "Although I have never been to a military academy, I have heard from my colleagues that in the 3 major military academies and the Westwoods Military Academy's mobility department, every year, there would be a few idiots who did not follow the military standard manual and tried to operate a mecha to perform a flying kick, a flip fork, a 720-degree landing, these kinds of idiotic ideas, and were successfully injured from the fall." Sulu used a towel to dry his wet hair and smiled somewhat embarrassedly. He did not know that last year in the mecha combat room at Lihua University, Shoyu had once questioned his operation. After all, he had come from an unorthodox background. In Area H1 6th level test, he had only known how to use all possible methods to dodge. How could he have known that mecha operation in real life was strictly prohibited from doing such things? But I feel that if these moves are mastered well, they should be very advantageous in close-range mecha combat. Sulu felt his arm go numb and he leaned back. A mecha's mobility mainly lies in its movement on the ground. Jumping into the air won't make your teleportation faster, and fancy movements won't make your attack stronger. Bai Yulan took a sip of tea and said, "Actually, this is the same principle as close-range combat. I've observed your moves before, both your feet have never completely left the ground. This shows that you understand this principle very well." Sulu was silent for a moment. The 10 stances that Uncle Fengyu had taught him were all strange and heroic body movement techniques. The footwork of both feet was indeed very strange, but in these 10 stances, there was indeed no leaping movement. In fact, both feet had never left the ground at the same time. Every step forward was a sliding step, and the distance between the feet was at most a few centimeters. Could it be that this was the reason? Su Li's eyes narrowed out of habit. Feeling the violent feeling of the mecha's legs in the air and the gravitational pull of the somersault, he felt that the combat between a mecha and a human should be different. Those movements made him feel very different, an indescribable feeling. "I'll be more careful in the future." Sulu smiled and said to Bai Yulan, "You can go back first. Thank you for teaching me so much today." These words were not out of politeness. For Sulu, who had come from an unorthodox background, to be able to operate a military mecha so skillfully in such a short period of time, it was definitely because Bai Yulan had imparted all her years of military experience to him. "Then I'll be leaving first." Bai Yulan did not stand on ceremony. Holding her teacup, she gently stood up and lowered her head to ask, "You still want to practice?" "We don't have any support staff at this time. If there is a problem, I'm afraid it will be more troublesome." Right now, it was already 11 o'clock at night. Sulu did not want anyone to see him operate a mecha. Of course, he did not mind that there were no support technicians around. He nodded at Bai Yulan. Bai Yulan was silent for a moment. Before she left, she said, "Don't think too much. After all, you're not from the Lees of Philadelphia." Sulu was the only one left in the spacious battle room. He rested for a moment, then walked over to the control panel and turned off all the data acquisition devices. He also turned on the automatic shutdown system outside the battle room. After confirming that it was late at night and that there was no one else around, he picked up the black leather case and jumped back into the cockpit of the M37. The cockpit was designed for a single person, but it had left some storage space, so there was no problem putting the black leather case inside. After passing the fingerprint check, he opened the black leather case and took out a set of clothes that looked very soft but were actually quite heavy. In reality, this was of course not clothes. It was an antique simulation system that Sulu had modified after he had been inspired by the database in Professor Shin's laboratory. The external material of this simulation system was a type of polymer material, but inside, there were countless micron-scale sensor chips. It was extremely complex. If it had not been modified based on the design concepts of his predecessors, Sulu would probably never have been able to create this thing. Staring blankly at this simulation system, Sulo actually felt a little fearful for a moment. He did not know if he could actually succeed. His success in Area H1 had only been instantaneous. Being able to break through the defenses of Zhou Yu's mecha in that split second was all because of this. Li Xiaotong had invested 40 million. Other than the card he had given to Bai Yulan, most of the rest of the money had been invested in the modification of this simulation system. Compared to that, the workbench was really cheap. The interface between the simulation system and the M-series mecha had already been prepared beforehand. Although the input ports had long been removed from the later stages of the M-series mecha, the internal chip assembly lines had not been changed much. Sulo began to carefully and seriously reconnect. Controlling a mecha was as crazy as driving a car, and modifying a mecha was as daring and reckless as modifying a car. Among the mechanical engineers of the Federation, probably only Sulo, a student who had been led astray by Uncle Feng Yu, would do such a thing. After an indeterminate amount of time, Sulo finally raised his head again and applied 2 drops of eye drops. Every strand of his freshly washed hair was covered in sweat. He exhaled lightly and licked his somewhat dry lips. Taking off his clothes, he put them into the black leather case and secured the case in the storage area. He pressed a button on a small tool in his hand. A faint blue light seeped out from his hand and quickly covered the entire cockpit. However, it did not penetrate the exterior of the mecha. Sulo confirmed that this kind of interference would not affect the system of the mecha itself, and only then did he relax. He had already thrown away 2 of these little blue devices, and this was the 3rd one he had made. However, he was not worried, because the self-destruct mechanism of this little device was extremely powerful. Any attempt to crack the fingerprint lock would be blocked. No matter who picked it up, they would not be able to find out the true purpose of this little device. The structure of this little blue device was not complicated, but it could allow a person to temporarily hide under the brilliance of the first charter. Only the uncle's genius brain could have come up with such a nature-defying design. Sulo took a deep breath and looked quietly at the blue light in his hand, drawing courage and confidence from it. Since he was the uncle's only student, his modification of the simulation system would definitely not fail. Wearing only a pair of underwear, Sulo sat in the stuffy cockpit of the mecha like a naked and restless baby. After putting on the simulation system, he felt as if his body was covered with a heavy silk blanket. Every inch of his skin felt slightly taut. This phenomenon of the complete opposite of the sense of touch and pressure on his skin made it difficult for him to get used to in a short period of time. Plugging in the power supply and restarting the initial operation, the computer system was re-authenticated. The simulation system began to operate, and countless numbness appeared on his naked skin. Gradually, this feeling disappeared, but there were still some small prickling pains, as if many ants were courageously advancing into his pores. Fortunately, this feeling did not last long, otherwise Sulo would definitely have thought that the awesome engineers of the previous generation had designed this kind of system purely for extorting confessions through torture. The cockpit door slowly closed, and the sealed air hissed for the last time. Then, the engine behind the tall M37 began to roar. However, Sulo could no longer hear this sound. He could only look nervously at the data display in his helmet, waiting for the moment when the simulation system was completely connected. The black M37 still stood solemnly in the middle of the combat room. In the cockpit, Sulo closed his eyes and slowly felt the wonderful sensation on his skin. Then, he began to mobilize the power in his body. A slightly scorching warmth flowed according to his will, quickly occupying his entire body. Following those wide channels, it passed through his bones, tendons, blood, and flesh, releasing slightly onto the surface of his skin. The simulation system collected physiological signals from the human body's muscles and skin. Sulo seemed to have found a way for the simulation system to also identify the power in his body. This dual signal collection was the key to success. However, he did not have the slightest bit of confidence. It should be known that every success in the Federation's scientific career was based on countless failures. Sulu opened his eyes and looked at the pale green display screen before him. After a moment of silence, he moved his little finger. In the spacious combat room, the alloy finger hanging by the waist of the black M37 suddenly moved with a buzzing sound. So small, so wonderful that I, in the middle of the night, by Yulan returned to the Whitewater Company base. The CEO's office had specially allocated a mecha combat room for Team 7 to use. At this time, only he and Sulu had the password to enter. He opened the door and saw the scene in the combat room. Subconsciously, he stopped in his tracks. Because of Uncle Kong's final words in front of the Peninsula Hotel in Hong Kong, Bai Yulan had been guessing Su Li's true identity. That was why he had mentioned the Lees of Philadelphia earlier. He had already left, but he was worried that Su Lu would listen to his warning and forcefully experiment with those dangerous mecha movements. So, he had turned back halfway. As one of the most cold-blooded and powerful pilots in the federal military, Bai Yulan had a lot of hidden abilities. He had even completed those dangerous movements before, and had done them even more beautifully. So, although he had been surprised by Su Li's comprehension, he had not thought much of it. After all, the purpose of a mecha was to attack the target, not to perform. However, at this moment, he saw a black mecha moving quickly in the combat room using a strange movement technique. At the highest level of speed, it actually moved and leaped easily, and then executed a mid-air chopping and somersaulting move. Bai Yulan's eyes narrowed. When he saw that M37 in Su Li's hands effortlessly execute 7 consecutive mid-air chopping moves, his right hand finally could not help but subconsciously reach into the left pocket of his shirt. He, who had never smoked, silently lit a cigarette for himself. He focused on that black mecha moving quickly and crazily as it moved forward. Even if this was a performance, this kind of ability was a little too frightening. Bai Yulan stuffed the cigarette between his lips and took a deep drag. Suddenly, he remembered the words he had said to Su Lu this afternoon. It looked like he had been wrong. Even if Madman Li was in the mecha, this kid should still be able to put up a fight against that guy. He just needed some experience in killing intent. Su Lu did not know that night, Bai Yulan had personally witnessed him using the simulation system to operate his mecha. He had only confirmed one thing. Although that modified simulation system still had many flaws, such as being too inconvenient and slow in collecting data, it was already able to provide him with powerful support, allowing him to operate his mecha and perform those unimaginable moves. Of course, he did not give up on standard mecha training just like that. After all, if he wanted to operate a mecha in the future, the most important method would still be this joystick and touchscreen input method. Su Lu could not possibly modify all of his mecha to be like this M37. His performance during standard training puzzled Bai Yulan, because it was completely different from his crazy maneuvering that night. Moreover, Bai Yulan also noticed that M37 seemed to have been modified in some way by Su Lu. Su Lu was not worried that Bai Yulan would find out anything, because he trusted him, and he had to trust him. If he did not even have a trustworthy companion by his side, this kind of life would be a little too troublesome. Just like that, dozens of days quietly passed by in this kind of boring repetition. Zhou had long been discharged from the hospital, and the little baby was now even cuter than before. However, the distant wedding date made the minister's wife somewhat displeased, while Zhou Yu's brother seemed to have sensed something. During this period of time, Su Lu had gone to Hong Kong 4 times to speed up the process of helping the Nutshell Engineering Department develop the MX mecha. After all, an undercurrent was already surging towards that Senator Macklin, and the Empire was also making good use of this opportunity. After some thought, Su Lu decided not to let his personal hatred affect the interests of the Federation. Under the accompaniment of the muffled rain at the end of August, Su Lu and Bai Yulan once again boarded the high-speed rail, heading towards Hong Kong with great familiarity. However, at this time, neither of them could have imagined that there was a problem waiting for them. Chapter 233. In the short span of 2 months, Su Lu had already lost count of how many times he had come to Hong Kong. Returning to his old haunt in the rain, his mood was very relaxed, completely different from the first time he had come to Hong Kong. This bustling metropolis was no longer like that cold and indifferent monster. The girls on the streets with their tender breasts and tight thighs only made him feel very happy. The mountain torrents along New Yuezhou had long receded, so it was still early when the high-speed train arrived at Hong Kong. Outside the secret exit, there was already a car waiting for Su Lu and the other. Now, they were no longer staying at the Peninsula Hotel, but had directly gotten a temporary apartment in the industrial park. However, they had only stayed there a few times. Even the job of anonymously purchasing train tickets had been taken over by Secretary Shin. As early as a month ago, the Nutshell Engineering Department had formally reported to the relevant departments of the Federation government that the MX Mecha Research and Development Project had once again started. This kind of matter and the hidden meaning behind it would definitely attract the attention of a considerable number of people. Su Lu also didn't think that after coming here so many times and cooperating with the engineering department for so long, he could still keep it a secret from the Federal Academy of Science and the other powers, so he didn't really care much about Secretary Shin and the Nutshell Engineering Department's secrecy work. However, Secretary Shin and Chief Steward Jose seemed to be extremely confident in controlling the engineering department. In fact, until today, Su Li's underground work in the engineering department had indeed not been leaked. Because of this, Su Lu had a clearer understanding of the terrifying influence of the Tai family in the Federation. Only a few people knew about the research and development of the new generation MX Mecha. The tens of billions of people in the Federation had not heard anything. For them, the Quadrennial Federation presidential election was the most important thing in their lives. Although no one had forgotten the shock caused by the terrorist attack on the peace concert in the 4 states during the summer holiday, it had also become a part of the presidential election. The leader of the anti-government forces, Nan Shui, accepted an official interview with the Federation News Channel for the first time. He sternly denied that the armed forces in the mountains had anything to do with this terrorist attack, and also sternly condemned this violent method of harming the innocent. The anti-government forces used this extremely sincere gesture to slightly reduce the anger in the hearts of some Federation citizens. However, there were still more people who directly targeted them. Normally speaking, on the side of the presidential election, Senator Pobre should have remained silent after expressing his condemnation. Because at this time, every time he defended the anti-government forces, his political opponents could interpret it as, in order to protect his political capital to participate in the election, that illusory peace agreement, Senator Payable did not hesitate to turn black into white, forget his own position, and speak up for those butchers. However, this respected member of parliament stood up bravely with a determination and stubbornness that was completely different from the Federation politicians. Through the glass of the freight car, Su Lu looked at the campaign posters on the street and narrowed his eyes. The background color on the posters was pure dark blue, and there was a silhouette in front. It was the silhouette of Senator Pobre when he arrived at the Green Dragon Mountain Airport by military plane on the last day of last year. The silhouette was very clear. The lower hem of the senator's windbreaker was blown up and then turned into a campaign slogan. "That's our president." He thought of the sentence Shi Qinghai said in the bar. At this moment, he naturally understood the deeper meaning of Mr. Shi's words. Although Su Lu very much appreciated the attitude of this fellow countryman, he had to admit that this approach was difficult to please in front of the voters. The public opinion poll conducted by the Federation News Channel the day before yesterday had already proven the problems caused by the attack on the concert and Senator Pobre's attitude after the incident. The election combination of Ross and Macklin was almost as good as Pabre's. "This is our president," Sulu said to himself in his heart. "There's a situation in front," the truck driver suddenly said in a deep voice. The specific process of Su Lee's entry into the Nutshell Engineering Department had been arranged by Blackhawk Security Company. With Xue Nian's identity, it was naturally impossible for him to always be their driver, so the current driver was replaced. In the past few days, there had been no problems, but what happened today? Su Lu glanced at Bai Yulan and was infected by the calmness of this delicate man. The worry in his heart was slightly reduced. At this time, the truck had just driven from the industrial park to the engineering department when it was stopped by a checkpoint. It was obvious that this was a temporary checkpoint. Su Lu looked through a small crack at the black-clothed guards near the checkpoint. He suddenly felt that they looked familiar, and his heart skipped a beat. "People from the company," Bai Yulan lowered her eyes and said softly. Supervisor Jose had already prepared the entry and exit documents for the truck, but the guards at the checkpoint didn't seem to see those documents at all. They directly got on the truck, turned off the engine, and then opened the back compartment. Under the cold muzzle of the gun, Su Lu and Bai Yulan got off the truck. The port city, like the capital special district, was shrouded in the sultry August rain. The rain flowed down their hair. Su Lu looked at the well-trained and silent guards in black and understood what Bai Yulan meant. These people were professional mercenaries of the Whitewater Company. The rain gradually increased under the lights, but the black-clad mercenaries were not disorganized. They vigilantly escorted Su Lu and Bai Yulan to the checkpoint. The temporary checkpoint was only a few cars. In front of the headlights of a car, someone was holding an umbrella. Under the umbrella was an official wearing glasses. The Shell Motor Company was a core area of the Federation. In order to not attract public criticism, the security around the engineering department was basically handed over to the Federation's Whitewater Security Company. Since this company was basically the son of the Ministry of Defense, the Federation government was naturally very assured. Looking at the solemn-looking guards in the rain, Su Lu felt a sense of danger. But since they didn't intend to kill him at the beginning, it meant that they knew his background and didn't have the guts to do so. But when he saw the official, he felt that today's matter would be particularly troublesome. He had seen the official once in the Husk Institute. The official was the chief technical director of the Shell Motor Company's board of directors. He also held the position of an independent technical director. His position was very high and not ordinary people could compare to him. Under the black umbrella, the chief technical director of the Shell Motor Company looked coldly at Su Lu and Bai Yulan, who were escorted over, and said softly, "Whitewater Company's 7th technical director Su Lu and secretary Bai Yulan have violated the company's internal confidentiality rules and will be immediately detained for investigation. After the investigation, according to the relevant laws of the Federation, according to the facts of the crime, they will be transferred to the military court under the Ministry of Defense." Chapter 234. It was late at night in the outer area of the engineering department. It was raining heavily in August. The dark clouds covered all the nebulas. In the darkness, the headlights of the cars were somewhat dazzling due to the rain. Su Lu looked at the official under the umbrella and narrowed his eyes. He knew that the secret that he helped the engineering department was finally exposed. He just couldn't figure out whether the other party wanted to deal with him or to steal the fruit again. But no matter what, it shouldn't be the case that the big shot under the umbrella came to Hong Kong personally. Shell Motor Company was a giant Federation enterprise that prioritized technology. Under the supervision of the board of directors, the real backbone of the company was the engineering and technical staff. Su Lu was also one of the engineering and technical staff, but he was only a third-level technical supervisor. The official under the umbrella was the chief technical consultant of the Shell Motor Company. The chief technical consultant automatically became the independent technical director of the board of directors of Shell Motor Company. With the status of Shell Motor Company in the Federation, any member of the board of directors had great power and status. After the nutshell technical director under the umbrella finished speaking, he returned to silence. Through the pair of glasses, he waited for his answer. At this time, the rain was getting heavier and heavier. It stretched over the black umbrella above his head and splashed some water on the glasses. But the big shot didn't bother to wipe it off. He just looked at Sulu and wanted to know if this important young man would resist. They were surrounded by Whitewater Company's guards in black rainproof combat suits. Sulu knew that these people were either mercenaries who killed without batting an eyelid or special forces trained by the military. No matter how confident he was by Yuan and himself, he didn't think of resisting because these black-clothed guards were holding their spears tightly. At this time, an umbrella came to Su Li's head and blocked the rain from falling from the sky. Su Lu looked back and saw Secretary Bai standing behind him with her head down. He didn't know when this person turned from beside him into an umbrella. The rainy night was dark and wet, and the industrial park was silent. Only the area illuminated by the headlights of the cars was still facing each other. The difference in the number of people on both sides was too great, so this confrontation seemed to be about to end. However, as soon as this umbrella appeared, only the independent director and Su Lu were not worried about the consequences. It subtly turned the atmosphere around. Su Lu looked at things with a sharpness that was completely inconsistent with his sincere appearance. From the moment he was stopped by the checkpoint to the appearance of this Mr. Independent Director, he quickly analyzed the situation and confirmed that the other party had a rough idea of his background, so he didn't dare to use force recklessly. However, the other party would definitely do everything possible to isolate him from the engineering department to ensure that the Federal Academy of Science would be the first to successfully develop MX. He wiped the rain off his face, stared at the director's glasses, and said, "I don't understand what confidentiality rules I violated." "You don't have to explain anything. I am honored that you came here specifically for me, but I think you should know that I now have long-term access to the engineering department." As if she wanted to add momentum to Su Li's rebuttal, by Magnolia, who had been holding an umbrella behind him with her head slightly lowered, raised her head and coldly scanned the surrounding Whitewater Company guards. Her eyes were calm and quiet, but there was an extremely repressed coldness in them. The headlights of the cars were originally a little hazy due to the heavy rain, but the moment Magnolia raised her head, a flash of lightning suddenly flashed through the ink-like rain clouds in the sky, illuminating the dim world for a moment and revealing the delicate face in front of everyone. When the surrounding Whitewater mercenaries in black combat suits saw this delicate and quiet face, the originally cold and silent formation changed a little. It was not a commotion, but it was vigilance, absolute vigilance. This was because they all recognized this face. This face could only belong to Magnolia, the former combat manager of the company's 7th team. Within the Whitewater Company, this delicate man was not famous because no one was willing to talk about him. The Whitewater mercenaries, who killed without blinking an eye, felt fear from the depths of their hearts when they talked about this man who looked like a woman but was more ruthless than anyone else. The independent director looked at the two people in the rain indifferently. He had no desire to debate with them. Today's trip to Hong Kong was mainly to use his position in the company to suppress the backlash from the engineering department. As for Su Lu and the secretary behind him, he was a little afraid of their background, but he was not worried that they would dare to confront so many combat personnel directly. Although they were faintly uneasy, the combat personnel in black still pressed forward. They did not pay attention to Su Lu, who looked very ordinary. Instead, they focused most of their attention on the seemingly fragile Magnolia. Their muzzles were aimed at his vital points, and their eyes did not leave his wrist. This was because they knew very well how terrifying this delicate man's close combat ability was. Back in the Bermuda Triangle Star region, this man even killed 7 Bermuda bandits with only a small knife. At this time, although the other party did not have a gun in his hand, they still did not dare to let their guard down. By Magnolia still held the umbrella, but she took a step forward and blocked in front of Su Lo. Her left hand quietly reached into her trouser pocket. It was such a simple action, but it made the movements of the armed guards next to her pause. These people could feel the danger from By Magnolia's action, so they did not understand why By Magnolia, as an employee of the company, still wanted to protect Su Lo despite the board's order. This was not in line with By Magnolia's usual style. Thinking of this, Su Li's figure became somewhat unfathomable in their hearts. Clearly, this young technical director did not have the slightest unusual aura, but he was able to subdue this beautiful knife. It was really hard to imagine. By some time, Su Lo knew that the current situation was very troublesome. If he did not resist, with the other party's strong power in the Federation, they could easily put him under house arrest for many days without doing anything to him. The chief technical director, seeing Su Li's slightly moving lips, suddenly said with a smile, "Don't try to resist. Although I don't want to, I think there should be a lot of people who would like to see an accident happen." Su Li's palm gently rested on Bai Yulan's shoulder, preventing her from unleashing a vicious attack. At this moment, 2 people hurriedly ran over from the engineering department. They didn't even bother to use the umbrellas in their hands to block the rain. They angrily scolded the Whitewater Company's soldiers from the outside before rushing in. The independent director's face was a bit gloomy. Although he knew that there was absolutely no way to hide what happened tonight from the engineering department, he did not expect that Jose could discover the board's little trick in such a short time under the cover of the dark night and heavy rain. Manager Jose was soaking wet. Looking at the tense situation, he took a deep breath and calmed the anger in his heart. He looked back at the director and said in a deep voice, "I personally approve Su Li's long-term authority. Is there a problem?" "No problem." The director's face was slightly gloomy, and he bluntly criticized, "You should know where your approval authority is. Do you not have any rules? Do you still have any respect for the board?" The Nutshell Company was a huge corporation. There were many departments under it, and an important territory like the engineering department naturally had a different status. If it were to be compared to an ancient dynasty, Jose was like a feudal lord. However, the independent technical director from the board was like an imperial envoy. Unless the engineering department dared to rebel, whether it was in terms of power or qualifications, he had no way to go against the board. Therefore, the director used a reprimanding tone to speak and did not give Jose any face at all. In fact, in this tense situation tonight, the internal disputes of the Nutshell Company had already begun to appear. Zhou Yu raised his umbrella and covered Jose's head. He looked at Su Lo with concern. Su Lo shook his head, indicating that there was no problem. After Jose calmed down for a moment, he said to this big shot, "This is not a research institute, this is the engineering department. According to the rules of the board of directors, I have the qualifications to approve. If you have any objections to my qualifications, you can raise them at the board meeting, but do not make it difficult for our staff." Su Lo is a staff member of the engineering department. He was not in the past, not today, and definitely not in the future. The director said with a serious face, "You have the qualifications to approve, but do not forget that Su Lo came into contact with the top secret MX of the Federation. According to the classification, these approvals are in the company's headquarters. I don't remember when the board of directors gave you the right to make your own decisions." His next sentence directly shattered Jose's thoughts of wanting to protect Su Lo. "The board of directors has an emergency meeting. We have temporarily stripped your qualifications to approve. All the new staff members who came into contact with MX in the past 2 months will all be brought back for investigation. This is the decision of the board of directors. If you object, please keep it to yourself." This was a very fatal problem. If the board of directors of Nutshell had really made such a decision, then Su Li's access rights would be considered illegal. The other party could investigate him in the name of violating the company's rules and regulations. They could even use the crime of coming into contact with the Federation's confidential data to send him to court. After saying this, the director no longer paid any attention to the silent Jose. He took 2 steps forward and walked into the range of the car's headlights. Looking at Su Lu, he said calmly, "Come with us. You know I won't make things difficult for you. However, during this period of time, you will need to rest somewhere else." Su Lu shook his head. After the incident at Hushan Road, the big shots in the Federation all knew of his relationship with the Tai family. Of course, they would not dare to kill him casually. However, if he resisted, they would be able to find a suitable reason. If he did not resist, they would be able to take him away and forcefully delay the engineering department's mecha development work. He just did not understand why the other party, who was clearly an independent director of Nutshell, would harm the company's interests and stand on the side of those people. "You're just a director of Nutshell. You can't control me." Su Lu took out his ID from his shirt pocket and handed it to the director. He said, "This is my ID. It says on it that I have the authority of the Ministry of National Defense's General Assembly base. Unless the Minister of National Defense personally gives the order, no one can stop me from entering the engineering department tonight." Chapter 235. In the eyes of many people, Su Lu was just an ordinary guy, at least on the surface. After coming to the capital ring, there were too many outstanding men around him. Whether it was in terms of appearance or inner qualities, they were all much more eye-catching than him. So when he said those words, the director couldn't help but be stunned and began to re-examine him. After taking the ID and looking at it under the headlights of the car, the company's technical director didn't return the ID to Su Lu. He didn't say anything either. Instead, he turned around and walked toward the edge of the crowd. He took out his phone. The Whitewater Company's guards were still holding Su Lu and Bai Yulan in the middle. Without his order, no one dared to let them go. The director took out his encrypted phone and dialed a number. After a while, he asked in a gloomy voice, "Didn't you say that Su Lu and Zhou Yingxing shouldn't be related? That's just a cover. Why does Su Lu have the ID from the Department of Defense?" Secretary Luo's voice came from the other end of the phone. This close subordinate of Dean Lin of the Federal Academy of Science didn't seem to have expected that Su Lu would take out the special permission from the Department of Defense. He said with some surprise, "According to the analysis of the FBI, Su Lu and the daughter of the Zhou family should be working together. If that's the case, why would the Department of Defense get involved? Could it be the madam's idea?" The director asked in a low voice. He suddenly felt that the August rain was a little cold. "I'm not sure, but Mr. Director, since things have come to this point, we have to continue," Secretary Luo said softly on the other end of the phone. The faint sound of a violin came from the side. The director of the Federation's technical director had a very high status in the Federation. Facing Dean Lin's secretary, he naturally didn't show any fear. He said coldly, "If it's just an internal company matter, of course I can do it. However, this involves the Department of Defense. I don't want to have a conflict with the federal military." After a moment of silence, Secretary Luo said, "Please wait a moment. Dean Lin wants to talk to you." The technical director held the phone and stood under the umbrella. Suddenly, he felt a little unhappy. He turned around and coldly looked at his subordinate. He scolded, "How did you open the umbrella? Can't you see that my shoulders are wet?" The subordinate holding the umbrella panicked slightly and hurriedly extended the umbrella forward, but he didn't dare to say anything. He knew very well that the official he served had already panicked because of the Department of Defense authority that the other party had taken out. An old voice came from the phone. It's only 4 in the morning. Fortunately, I have the habit of waking up early to play the violin. The technical director cursed in his heart. Who doesn't know that you usually wake up at 6 o'clock? Today, you can't sleep well. Even Secretary Luo is by your side. Naturally, you want to wait for news from me. However, the person on the other end of the line was, after all, a leading figure in the academic world of the Federation of Nations. After pondering for a moment, he said, Sulu took out the authority of the Ministry of Defense. I have no choice. I have to leave first. The old voice on the other end of the phone was silent for a moment, then suddenly said in a deep voice, so what if you have the authority of the Ministry of National Defense? After all, he is still an employee of Nutshell. I don't ask you to bring him in front of me, but I don't want this little soldier to crawl under the Ministry of Engineering again. You know what this means. Hearing the angry voice on the other end of the line, the director's expression became cold. He thought that in the face of material gain, this old guy finally didn't care about the so-called demeanor anymore. He said into the phone, I'm sorry, but I can't comply. I know that you don't want to be pressured by the military, but you shouldn't overestimate the power of the Tai family. The leader of the academic world of the Federation of Nations on the other end of the line softened his tone and said, in fact, I don't know how that little guy from the Lee family convinced you, but I think that since you stood on his side from the beginning, he must be very willing to let you stand on his side. Hearing the two words Lee family, the director's expression became slightly pale. He slowly hung up the phone and walked towards the center of the crowd. In this short distance, he thought of a lot of things. He thought of those luxurious nights at the MGM Maystar Casino at the entrance of Bermuda, thought of the 300 million gambling debt he owed, thought of those videotapes. The high and mighty Nutshell director was actually toyed with by such an old-fashioned and despicable method. He couldn't help but mock himself. Only now did he understand that no matter which era it was, money was the most ferocious devil. The most primitive method was often the most frightening method. He was the prisoner who was blinded by the devil's primitive method. Walking in front of Sulu, the director handed the ID back to Sulu with a cold face. He had already made a decision. In fact, between losing his reputation and going against the Ministry of Defense, he could only choose the latter. He angrily and irritably knocked away the umbrella that was held by his subordinates behind him. The director stared at Su Li's eyes and said coldly, "Arrest them." The rain soaked the hair of this middle-aged man. Together with his somewhat twisted face, he looked particularly ferocious. When the director made the call, Sulu thought that the director was verifying the authenticity of the confidential authority of the Ministry of Defense through the phone. However, when the director's expression became so cold and ferocious, he knew that things had changed. He didn't know if it was the Lee family or the Federal Academy of Science that found a way to make this independent director of Nutshell disregard the authority of the Ministry of Defense and make such a crazy move. When a person was unreasonable, any rules and principles in the Federation would not work on him. To deal with such a person, one could only be more unreasonable than him. The moment his finger took back the ID, Sulu was already preparing for this. The director in the rain in front of him was obviously blinded by the previous negotiations and underestimated the determination that Sulu would show in this incident. He slammed his foot on the ground, and countless splashes shot out like arrows, making the light of the car's headlights appear even dimmer. At this time, layers of rain fell from the sky. There was no lightning or thunder. It was the dark season, and only the light in the rain could help see things. This was the purpose of Su Li's first kick. By Magnolia, who had been holding an umbrella behind him, moved at the same time. This delicate man and Sulu hadn't known each other for a long time, but the two of them had already formed a very subtle tacit relationship, just like when they were fighting in front of the Peninsula Hotel in Hong Kong. Just as Sulu raised his leg, Magnolia had already thrown the umbrella in her hand. The black umbrella, which didn't allow light to pass through, fluttered in the wind and rain, and happened to block the headlights of the other car for a moment. The light in the field was slightly disrupted, and shadows moved randomly. Before the guards of the Whitewater Company had time to pull the trigger, the umbrella and the rain of arrows fell softly to the ground at the same time. In such a short period of time, the situation on the battlefield had changed greatly. The director was drenched, and his face was pale. His neck was tightly gripped by Su Shou's right hand, and he was dragged to the front of the car. Su Lu used his body to block the aim of the guns. By Magnolia, like a shadow, also came to his side, but didn't look for any obstacles. He just lowered his head slightly, observing the movements of his colleagues in the rain. He didn't have a gun in his hand, only a delicate knife. "Put down your guns," Su Lu said to the surrounding Whitewater Company guards. The guards didn't react at all. In the middle of the encirclement, the two people held the director hostage. In addition to fear, these well-trained mercenaries felt more shame. At this time, it was impossible for them to throw away the guns in their hands. Instead, they held their guns and approached the car inch by inch. The rain hit the metal guns, the hands that held the guns steadily, and everyone's heart. No one knew what would happen in the next moment. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and found that the situation was out of control. He cautiously moved his head to the director's ear and whispered, "This shouldn't be the ending you want. I don't want to kill people, but I don't want to go with you either. Is there any better way?" The paleness on the director's face gradually faded. He said, "This is great. Attacking a senior officer and taking a hostage. Regardless of whether you can clear these charges or not, you can't enter the engineering department again. Of course, if you kill me, your life is over." The rain hit Su Li's face. After a moment of silence, he asked, "What do those people know about you? Do I need to tell you?" The director sneered. The expression on his face was still ferocious, but then he let out a painful groan. Following this miserable groan, the surrounding security personnel stopped in their tracks. Looking at the scene in front of the car, they revealed a trace of uneasiness. By Magnolia stabbed the knife directly into the director's groin. His delicate hand was still holding the slender knife tightly. He lowered his head in the rain and didn't look at the gloomy gun barrels that were close at hand. He said softly, "Everyone here is an expert. You should know that if my hand trembles now, the knife will cut open Mr. Director's aorta. If you can kill me in one shot, when I fall, the tip of the knife will cut open a section of the aorta. When the time comes, the severed blood vessels will shrink into the muscles, and you won't be able to find it no matter how hard you look. I'm rarely so long-winded." By Magnolia raised his head and let the rain slide down his face. He looked at the gun barrels around him and said seriously, "I'm worried that there are novices among you who can't see this." The mercenaries of the Whitewater Company were all veterans. The leader of the team waved his arm and stopped his subordinates from advancing. He no longer tried to pressure the two young kidnappers with his aura. He knew that every word by Magnolia said was true, and it was obvious that the other party was cold-blooded to the extreme and would not make mistakes like he did. "What are you waiting for?" The director's face was distorted. He reprimanded them loudly, "You are a bunch of trash." There was no one in this world who was not afraid of death, and the respected chief technical director was even more so. However, he did not think that the two kidnappers would dare to kill him, because Su Lu had a strong background and a bright future. Such a person would never do something as unsightly as a life-and-death struggle. The pain in his leg was very real, but this kind of pain made him a little crazy. He angrily scolded the Whitewater guards who did not dare to step forward. At the same time, he turned his head and scolded Su Lu fiercely, "Young man, you're finished. No matter the outcome, just because of this incident, the entire Federation will not tolerate you." At this time, Director Jose had already been pushed aside by the guards. He anxiously shouted to Sulu across the crowd, "Sulu, don't do anything stupid." The security work of the engineering department was originally contracted by the Whitewater Company. Although he was the director of the engineering department, he could not command these paramilitary personnel. Moreover, the director was currently in Su Li's hands. That Secretary Bai had actually stabbed the director so carelessly. This fact made him feel unprecedented pressure. They knew that Su Lu could not be tied up without a fight, but if he persisted, what if the Whitewater guards really wanted to kill him? He subconsciously wanted Zhou Yu to inform Secretary Shin, regardless of whether it was too late. Who knew that when he turned around, he would find that there was no one beside him. Su Lu did not pay attention to the shouts of these two people. He just narrowed his eyes in the dark rain and watched the movements of the guards. When he saw the index finger of the captain slowly move away from the trigger, he felt slightly relieved. However, at this time, he sharply noticed that one of the guards seemed to have been inadvertently dragged to the periphery. At this moment, he raised the light sniper rifle in his hand and aimed it between Bai Yulan's eyebrows. Bai Yulan also sensitively noticed this. He slightly lowered his head and looked over with cold eyes. If this was in the past, he would definitely rush into the crowd at this time, even if the other party was also a well-trained mercenary. However, at this moment, he could only coldly look at the gunman, because Su Lu was still behind him. A sense of danger surged in Su Li's heart, just like when the Special Task Force agent appeared in Linhai during the New Year. The gunman was probably not one of the director's men. If he opened fire now, it would be a chaotic battle. He was afraid that the director and Su Lu would die on the spot, and the real mastermind behind the scenes would be able to get away scot-free. Thinking of this, he could not do anything, because once he raised his hands and surrendered, all his previous efforts would be in vain. However, the light in his eyes gradually dimmed, as if he had not noticed anything that he thought for a long time, but in reality, in the rainy night, it only took a blink of an eye. The Whitewater Company's guards were still aiming their guns at Su Lu and Bai Yulan, but the gunman outside the crowd had already coldly pulled the trigger. After a muffled sound, a bullet lit up in the rainy night. It slid past the edge of the car's headlights, whistled through the puddles, and shot into the hard ground of the industrial park. Su Lu and Bai Yulan both had time to dodge, but this shot missed. This was because at the moment before the gunman opened fire, a figure used the cover of the rainy night to quietly go behind the gunman from behind. A palm hit the gunman's elbow, interfering with his shooting, and at the same time, a palm strike was viciously aimed at the gunman's neck. The gunman was a very strong character, as he was able to react in such a short time. He turned his head and dodged the palm strike. In the dim rain, he could clearly see that the attacker was the gentle engineer from the engineering department. He did not pay much attention to it, as he was prepared to knock down the engineer and then take advantage of the chaos to escape. The poor gunman did not know that this seemingly gentle engineer was the most outstanding student in this batch of the First Military Academy. Although he was not as meticulous as his predecessors, Shun Li and Shi Qinghai, he still had extremely strong mobility. With a crisp crack, Zhou Yu, whose military uniform was already drenched in sweat, used 3 extremely simple and practical movements to knock the gunman to the ground. He also broke the gunman's upper arm in passing. His attack was extremely ruthless. At the moment the gunshot rang out, no one would think about where the gunshot came from. Instead, they would think about who the gunshot had hit. After the well-trained Whitewater Company guards found that no one was hit, they did not go crazy and start firing randomly. However, the situation was complicated, and no one knew what was going on. Those gun barrels could spew out flames at any time. 2 military helicopters flew over at high speed, and the sound of gunshots rang out amidst the flames. In the rain, a deep trench was plowed on the ground by the powerful guns and cannons. We are Unit 8384 of the Harbor City Garrison District. Everyone, Put down your weapons immediately, put down your weapons immediately. Otherwise, we will kill without mercy, kill without mercy. From the dark green military helicopter's microphone, a stern voice sounded, as if it was explaining the power of his order. The rotary gun barrels on the aircraft began to rotate at high speed again, making bursts of metal grinding sounds in the rainy night that a deep trench appeared on the hard ground of the industrial park. The high temperature was still maintained in the marks made by the high-speed bullets. The rainwater that fell into the trench sizzled and turned into a faint mist. The debris that was blown away by the powerful firepower of Darren's rotary gun hit the edge of the car, and the metal doors were densely packed with small dots. Although the majority of the Whitewater Company guards were former soldiers of the Federation, their current status was only that of mercenaries. Facing the imposing federal military helicopters, they did not have any intention of resisting. Moreover, the unreasonable gunfire from the cannons had already proved the viciousness of these soldiers. In a situation where they did not have heavy weapons, wanting to face the Federal Army head-on was like a bare-handed person fighting a military mech. In this world, there were not that many Feng Yu and Su Lu. Supervisor Jose stared blankly at the dark green helicopter that landed on the ground, at the Federation soldiers that filed out, and then at the Whitewater Company guards that put down their weapons under Darren's gun barrel. For a moment, he could not help but be stunned. He did not understand what had happened, and why Unit 8384 of the Garrison District would suddenly appear here. An officer walked down from the helicopter, and the rainwater hit his military cap, making patter sounds. The officer did not care about the strange gazes around him. Instead, he hurriedly jogged in front of Su Lu, and with a clap, he saluted and said in a deep voice, "Under the orders of the Ministry of National Defense, Unit 8384's Major Lan Xiaolong is here to report to the Chief. We await the Chief's orders." Chapter 236. The rain gradually lessened, but the night wind began to seize the last moments of the summer to travel through the plains and mountains to the south of the port city. With the addition of the wind stirred up by the two helicopters, it appeared to be a bit stronger. It swept up slightly moist water droplets and slapped onto people's faces, making them wet and cold. In the wind and rain, Su Lu heard someone call him Chief for the first time. He couldn't help but be stunned. He thought to himself that he was only a captain, but this officer was a colonel. How exactly were these ranks divided? On the side, Manager Jose had long been shocked by these soldiers of the Federation. Although he had a lot of dealings with the military, when he saw two combat helicopters and a large group of fully armed soldiers brazenly entering the industrial park just for Su Lu, he naturally had more thoughts in his mind. The major named Lan Xiaolong saluted Su Lu. After receiving his response, he took a step to the left and looked at the director, who was half leaning on the front of the car with a serious expression. He said in a deep voice, "Because you are suspected of interfering with the confidential affairs of the Federal Army and intending to murder an active duty officer, this, sir, you may need to be investigated." Not long after, the charge that the director had assigned to Su Lu was returned to him by this officer. The things in the world were always so wonderful. The director endured the intense pain at the base of his leg and looked coldly at the major in front of him. He said, "You are just a little major, and you dare to be so presumptuous." The major saluted with a bang and said, "Sir, the major is not a little major, but he is not presumptuous. I am only asking you to cooperate with the investigation according to the orders of the superior. Of course, we believe that as the most loyal partner of the federal military, the respected board member of the Nutshell Company will definitely not be a criminal." The major suddenly changed the topic and said with a smile, "But you are injured now. How about we use the helicopter to send you to the police hospital for treatment?" At first, he was serious and upright, then he lowered his body and teased, politely with a hint of banter. "Su Lu and Mr. Jose looked at this officer and couldn't help but be stunned. When the truck was stopped at the checkpoint earlier, Sulu had informed Secretary Zhao. However, he did not expect that it would take such a short time for the Ministry of Defense to send someone over. Moreover, the person who came was an officer that he could not see through. A member of the board of directors of the Shell Motor Company was a big shot. Even if he was facing a powerful military force, he would not be afraid. Therefore, the way this major handled the situation was very appropriate. Bai Yulan had been keeping her head down the entire time. When she heard this, she casually pulled out a small knife. Mr. Director groaned in pain. He felt a burst of coldness at the base of his leg. He thought that his artery had been cut. He was scared out of his wits. His legs went soft and he wanted to fall to the ground. But he was supported by two soldiers, one on the left and one on the right. Major Lan Xiaolong squatted down and checked his injury. He comforted him and said, "Don't worry, it is only a flesh wound." When the knife was pulled out, it did not even shake. Under the supervision of the Federal Army, the whitewater soldiers wearing black rain protection combat suits scattered in all directions. There was not much worry on their faces. After all, in terms of bone structure, they were all members of the same system. Tonight's conflict was just a competition between the big shots of the Federation. After they were arrested and sent to the police station, they would not be too miserable. With the help of the soldiers, the pale-faced Mr. Director boarded the helicopter and left in a sorry state. All that was left was the rain, the dim lights, and the deep trench that was blasted by the machine gun. Because of the brazen intervention of the Federal Army, the operation specifically targeting Sulu collapsed. Whether it was the 7 major families or the Federal Academy of Science, in the face of the participation of the military, they had to choose to retreat. Presumably, at the beginning, those big shots would not have thought that the Federal Army, which had many internal factions, would actually unite for a person like Sulu. They would not hesitate to shed all pretense of cordiality with them. In the end, it was these big shots from the secular world who did not understand the iron will of the Federal Army and the strong desire to win the war for the Empire. The only pity was that the assassin that was subdued by Zhou Yu still chewed up the poison pill buried deep in the mucous membranes of his mouth even though he had lost an arm. This kind of extreme method of burying poison, even Zhou Yu, who had received professional training, was not able to discover it in the first moment. No assassin is willing to die. He must have a backup plan. Under the pursuit of charter, his only backup plan is to leave the Federation and go as far as Bermuda. Zhou Yu took off his wet clothes and said to Sulu, "In order to escape the pursuit of the Federation as quickly as possible, this assassin's backup plan could only be at the spaceport in Harbor City." Sulu immediately understood Zhou Yu's meaning. He turned his head and whispered a few words to Major Lan Xiaolong. The other party called him Chief. He did not know if the other party was joking or not, but he did not really think that he could order the other party to do things. Lan Xiaolong nodded with a serious expression and reported this information to the relevant departments in the garrison. After the phone call, his eyes fell on Magnolia Bai, who was beside Sulu. That delicate man made him feel a little complicated. After taking a hot shower, Sulu put all his busy and nervous feelings behind him. In the underground office of the engineering department, he dialed Secretary Zhao's number. After waiting for a while, a calm and tired voice came from the other end of the phone. Unit 8384 has not been on the front line for many years, but their combat strength is not bad. From now on, until the MX is successfully developed, they will be responsible for your safety. Sulu held the phone and nodded. Facing the eyes of the aristocratic families and the politicians, as well as the power and dark methods, he was indeed a little tired. Being able to obtain the protection of the Federal Army was naturally the best way. He did not have to worry about his own safety anymore. However, he heard something else from the voice of this big boss of the Department of Defense. Deputy Minister Zhou seemed to be under a great deal of pressure. I will raise this matter to the higher-ups during the joint conference, Deputy Minister Zhou said over the phone. Su Le nodded. He knew in his heart that the higher-ups of the Joint Conference of Staff were naturally President Sig. Mr. President asked the office staff to knock on the Joint Conference of Staff. Naturally, the Joint Conference of Staff would not dare to do anything. Immediately after, he somewhat understood where Deputy Minister Zhou's pressure came from. Mobilizing the garrison forces was definitely not something that the Deputy Minister of Defense could decide alone. However, the obvious bias shown in this matter could make people think that he was too close to the Tai family. This was definitely not in line with the political ethics of a cabinet member of the Federation government. Last time, I said that the Federation only needs the MX to be developed. The other end of the phone was silent for a moment. Zhou Yingxing said in a cold and serious tone, but now I hope that the first to succeed is the engineering department, or rather, you. Chapter 237. He was a very interesting and insightful laughter. It originated from Wang Dong and became famous from Instructor Zhang's mouth. I liked Zhang Lu's commentary the most, especially when he was paired with Ah Huang. Every weekend, I would only hear the two of them laughing obscenely. It was great. Now, Instructor Zhang had the voice but not the form. Without sarcasm or sarcasm in crosstalk, what kind of art would it be? I had also been these 2 days because I was really proud. Especially now that the work was completed, the feeling of pride was even stronger. I couldn't help but chuckle a few more times. I was so proud of myself that I said I was going to explode. In these 7 days, I wrote 75,000 words. If I don't compare myself to other awesome people, just looking at my career of making up stories to entertain everyone, this is really the first time. I have never worked so hard before. Moreover, my effort was so beautiful that it went straight to the point where my nature was playful. I was proud of everyone. I had asked for votes in the last 2 hours, but I still managed to get so many votes. I had always been a narcissist, especially after 7 days. I thought that I was a hardworking and hidden talent. However, I didn't expect that everyone was the one who had truly hidden their talent. You were indeed better than me. If there were no accidents, I should be 4th this month. I was very satisfied. Thank you everyone. Compared to last month's 4th, I felt much more comfortable and at ease. That was because last month's work was really bad and the writing was average. Oh right, this was the 3rd reason why I was so proud of myself. This month, it was more of one thing. The key was that I seemed to have found the rhythm of writing this kind of story, just like how Su Lo was trying to capture the rhythm of the Magnolia. The later parts of the story would occasionally stagnate, but that was basically because my brain was blocked. Most of the time, the story of the spy began to move forward, and I was very pleased with this. At the beginning of the month, I had promised everyone that I would write 200,000 words this month. Wait a minute, I had to count the words. When I came back, I had written about 230,000 words. I thought it would be a lot more. I was about to say that I had exceeded the quota, but it seems that I had to say that I had perfectly completed the task. The reason for the 7 days of exploding was actually mentioned in the announcement. The main reason was that I was relatively free at the end of the month, so I had time to play. Next month, I would be too busy. Well, that was the main point. Next month, I would be really busy. There were too many things for a family man to do. Moreover, I was in a foreign land. Everyone knew that only my leader and I had to work hard. There were many things that we had to do by ourselves. We couldn't ask for help, so I was busy and busy. I would like to formally inform everyone that my goal for September is to get 150,000 words. Promise to keep updating, but but I really didn't have time. Chapter 238. These last words of Deputy Minister Zhou finally revealed a sliver of the pressure he was under. However, this enormous pressure was successfully transferred onto Su Lu through these words. After he put down the phone, he was silent for a long time before resuming his work at the Nutshell Engineering Department. The Federation's new generation MX mecha development had always been carried out by the Nutshell Engineering Department alone. However, after the failure, the Federal Academy of Science had quickly discovered an opportunity in this matter. After seizing Professor Shin's core data, the Mecha Development Department had long since been naturally divided into two factions. The competition between the two sides would also indirectly affect the Federation's presidential election. No matter which side it was a bargaining chip that could not be given up. The competition between the two sides had actually always been hidden under the surface. It was only because of the variable known as Su Lu that the Academy of Science had felt anxious. That was why there had been that conflict on that rainy night, bringing this competition to the surface. In that conflict, the Port City Garrison Unit 8384 had officially taken over the security work of the Nutshell Engineering Department under the orders of the Department of National Defense. After this incident, the two sides had officially shed all pretense of cordiality. Su Lu knew that his role in the development of MX was no longer a secret. However, now that he had so many Federation soldiers protecting him, while he felt slightly restricted, he also felt much more relaxed. With the federal military, or at least a portion of the military's strength, standing behind him, this sense of security was something he would never have imagined in the past. The military was loyal to the President and the Federation. Countless years of history and the monitoring of the Constitution could guarantee that this loyalty would never be mixed with anything else. However, it was still a large and privileged system, so the internal structure was still divided according to the divisions of the various military regions or the combat forces during the Great War years, divided into several large factions. Among these military factions, the most special and transcendent was naturally the Federation Space Warship Fleet led by that 3-star female general. 4 groups of warships patrolled the peaceful stars of the universe, independent and natural. In addition, the federal military had 4 major military regions. Among them, the most advanced and powerful was naturally the 1st military region stationed on planet S1, and the 4th military region, which was perennially in a state of confrontation with the Empire. Every time he thought of the Federation's military deployment, as an orphan of Donglin, Su Li's heart would surge with complicated emotions. The Donglin region was also a part of the Federation, but there was only one garrison on Donglin, a barren resource system. There was also no terrifying external enemy like the Empire, so it was no wonder the Federation did not value Donglin. Was always by Su Li's side, an armored combat battalion led by Major Lan Xiaolong, belonging to Unit 8384. Unit 8384 was actually the 17th independent land-based armored division of the 1st Military Region. It was an ace division with a glorious tradition. Its position in the federal military was special because the god of war, Li Pifu, once came from this division. He once led this armored division in the war with the Empire, creating one legend after another. Many years ago, Li Pifu left the 17th Armored Division and rose to become the commander of the federal military. After finally living in seclusion, the Department of Defense and the 1st Military Region headquarters were endlessly distressed about how to arrange the 17th Armored Division. The political requirements of the Federation were destined to not let this legend be destroyed, just like how no one dared to let the god of war, Li Pifu, a statue-level figure, fail even once. Therefore, the 17th Armored Division was withdrawn from the front line of the West Woods to Planet S1 and became the main military force in the most prosperous city garrison of the Federation, Unit 8384. Since they wanted an undefeated legend, if they didn't let this division go to war, naturally, they would never be defeated. Because of this secret meaning that couldn't be said out loud, the 17 Armored Division didn't participate in a real battle for many years. Even when the federal military arranged for the various military regions to take turns to fight on the front line of the West Woods, they didn't have a part to play in it. Until one time, when the god of war expressed his concern about the combat strength of the old division in his hometown in Philadelphia. Then, like a little wife, his disciples took some combat personnel below platoon level from the 17 Armored Division and sent them to Bermuda as a show of respect to the god of war. The Ace Armored Division had become a decoration because of political needs. Based in the place for a long time, interacting with society, and being influenced by the lights, the iron-blooded troops gradually became silent and mediocre in the most prosperous area of the Federation. Just like the number of their garrison, they became a little more like 83-84. Although there are a lot of mountains in the military, places like the 1st Military Region are all silent places for the senior generals because the 1st Military Region is always shrouded in the glory of the god of war. When Zhou Yu mentioned that name, his expression became a little serious. It seemed that if he didn't do so, he couldn't express the respect a professional soldier had for the god of war. I heard that the Li family has some influence in the 1st Military Region. After all, they are a family with a long history, and they have been sparing no effort to sponsor the living area of the military region. It seems like they don't care about the cost and just want to get some benefits. But you don't have to worry about anything. After all, the Li family is not the Zhong family. No matter how big their influence on the military is, it's limited. This was already something that happened a few days later. Su Lu was asking Zhou Yu about the complicated factions in the military. There was no less gossip and secret information in the military than in society. Zhou Yu, who was respected by his classmates and loved by his teachers in the 1st Military Academy, had a very clear understanding of the factions in the military. His fingers left the workbench, and he rubbed his temples tiredly. He leaned back in his chair and listened to Zhou Yu's explanation. However, his eyes drifted to the corner of the warehouse. In the past few days, he had already noticed that the major called Lan Xiaolong should know Bai Yulan. Because he forgot that Secretary Bai had once mentioned that he was from the 17th Armored Division, he didn't quite understand. In that corner, Major Lan Xiaolong was squatting on the ground and smoking. He was whispering something to Bai Yulan beside him. Bai Yulan still had a calm and gentle appearance. She crossed her arms, leaned against the wall, and lowered her head slightly. After a long time, she would reply softly. "That matter has already faded. Do you want me to go talk to the division commander and transfer you back from Whitewater?" Lan Xiaolong squatted on the ground and said, "The money in the military will definitely not be as much as you are now, but you will still have a status, and it will be much more stable." Bai Yulan looked at the tips of her shining boots and said softly, "You are already a major. Should I go back and start as a soldier? I got my position as a major through flattery. Why did I rush over with 2 helicopters this time? I know that this is a relationship between the big shots in the Federation, but I still have to take the risk. Also, that vice minister might really become a major next year. Why should I be afraid of taking a risk?" Lan Xiaolong nagged, "You are much more capable than me. When I was a company commander in the recruit camp, you could eat me alive. Go back to the 17th Armored Division and work hard for 2 years. Then the division commander will transfer you to his side and train you. Being a major is nothing." Unit 83-84. Bai Yulan softly repeated the unit number of her old unit. She laughed at herself and said softly, "I am not from the 17th Armored Division anymore. Life in Hong Kong is too easy. You are invited to those clubs every day. I am not used to this kind of life. I also like to enjoy myself, but I don't want to do this kind of thing in uniform. I wear plain clothes every time I go there." Lan Xiaolong said angrily. Bai Yulan lowered her head, smiled and said, "But I still don't have the face to go back. The Department of National Defense only let my division go after the war god gave the order. I went with the first batch, but I was the only one who came back alive. I made the 17th Division lose all its face. From then on, the military never even mentioned the matter of taking turns to battle. From this point of view, I also made the war god lose face once. Don't talk nonsense. The war god is fishing in Philadelphia. How would he know a small fish like you? Lon Xiaolong scolded in a low voice, you are just too unlucky. The Department of National Defense sent us to the edge of Bermuda for safety reasons. We thought that nothing would happen, so we were demoted to one of your classes. Who would have thought that we would meet the Empire's special bastard battalion on that godforsaken mining planet? A class against a battalion. Even if the Empire's mech pilots are really bastards, the only outcome would be complete annihilation. It's already very impressive of you to be able to escape and come back. Otherwise, with the teacher's temper, he would have executed you long ago. Why would he speak for you in the military court? Hearing the war god's name repeatedly, Bai Yulan lowered her eyes. She naturally thought of the time when she first joined the army. She was still a teenager. Her quiet and clever personality was noticed by the war god, so she was transferred to the war god's side as a messenger. After that, she made a name for herself in the 17th Armored Division. But, she raised her head and looked at Su Lo, who was silently working at the workbench. She said softly, I still can't go back. My life is not my own now. Lon Xiaolong followed her gaze and knew what Bai Yulan was talking about. He couldn't help but frown. He was now in charge of protecting that ordinary-looking technical supervisor. He really couldn't see anything special about that person. He also couldn't understand why Bai Yulan was always by that person's side. I sold my life to him for 20 million, Bai Yulan said with a smile. Lon Xiaolong was stunned. Then, he cursed under his breath. However, this soldier found that Bai Yulan seemed to be more talkative and more cheerful than a few years ago. He couldn't help but think, could it be because of that young man? Thinking of this, his impression of Su Lo improved a lot. Just as the engineering department was abnormally busy, and Bai Yulan and Lon Xiaolong were catching up with each other, manager Jose hurriedly walked into this spacious underground warehouse. His footsteps were heavy, and the expression on his face was even heavier. Watch the news, he said to Su Lo. There was a trace of worry in his eyes. Su Lo was slightly stunned. He could vaguely guess what had happened. The workbench connected to the engineering department's network couldn't go online. He took out his phone and switched to the Federation's news channel. He saw the male anchor on the screen saying in an excited tone, regarding the birth of this revolutionary mecha, how significant its military significance to the Federation, we would like to ask Professor Zhang of the Institute of Mechanical Engineering at the Academy of Sciences. Su Lo immediately logged onto the real-time news platform of the online newspaper. He saw a very eye-catching headline appear on the front page of the Capital Special District Daily. The Federal Academy of Science officially announces that the new generation of twin-engine MX mecha has been successfully developed. Chapter 239. The atmosphere in the underground storeroom suddenly became stifling. Bai Yulan walked behind Su Lo and lowered her head to look at the contents of the news. Zhou Yu's brows also furrowed. Jose sighed and brought up the news screen. Su Li's gaze moved away from the phone and landed on the news screen again. His eyes narrowed, and he remained silent. Everyone watched the news screen in silence. The scrolling news of the Federation was currently replaying the news conference held by the Federal Academy of Science today. In front of the dark blue background of the stage, the leader of the Federation's academic community, Dean Lin, was currently waving his arms and vigorously explaining something. Following his explanation, the 3D light screen behind him began to change. A light purple mecha gradually condensed within the light, revealing its intimidating and elegant figure. The 3D light screen changed again, and the new light purple mecha broke down into countless parts, floating in the air above the hall, revealing its advanced design concepts. In particular, the streamlined twin engines floating in the middle attracted everyone's attention. Countless cameras in the press conference were focused on the stage. The reporters were so shocked that they couldn't ask any questions. They all vaguely knew that the Federation was researching this revolutionary new mecha, but they didn't know that the Academy of Science had actually quietly succeeded in developing it. They knew better than the average citizen what kind of glory this new dual-engine mecha would bring to the Federation. This is a new era, an era that belongs to MX. Dean Lin placed both hands on the stage and used an extremely dignified gaze to calmly scan the surroundings as he spoke slowly. As his voice fell, the parts of the new mecha scattered around the 3D light screen began to gather towards the center. Accompanied by the beautiful sound of metal assembling, the new light purple MX was reassembled, emitting a faint glow. At the same time, the blue background suddenly turned into a soft existence like flowing water, pouring down like mercury. A realistic purple streamlined MX mecha appeared in front of everyone's eyes, gradually merging with the mecha in the three-dimensional light beam image. Then, the light beam dissipated, leaving behind the new mecha that was 7 meters tall, looking coldly and proudly at everyone at the press conference. The rolling news had ended, and the warehouse of the Shell Engineering Department was still silent. A depressing atmosphere hung over everyone's head. Supervisor Jose's face was pale, and Sulu lowered his head. Zhou Yu clenched his fists tightly. Secretary Bai tilted her head to look at him. Only Major Lan Xiaolong did not understand why these people seemed so dejected. The white MX mech that was fixed to the wall of the quarantine zone had yet to be assembled. Its 3 thick and heavy mechanical arms were slowly adjusting. The body of the white mech was slightly tilted to one side, as if it was watching the news in a daze. Even it did not understand why that purple goblin on the screen had been born before it. No one knew better than the people present what the Federal Academy of Sciences' announcement of the successful development of the MX mech represented. This meant that the Shell Motor Company's 10 years of hard work had all become a wedding dress for the Federal Academy of Science. This meant that the hard work of countless engineers had all been for naught. For Sulu, this meant even more. For example, Professor Shin, the presidential election, shameless people. Bai Yulan, who was standing behind him, looked at his dejected back with a complicated expression. Suddenly, she whispered a few words to Zhou Yu. Zhou Yu shook his head. The information of the engineering department had been leaked. This had already been determined after the arrest of the board of directors. However, the most suspicious person, Supervisor Hao, had already been transferred away before the incident. From a certain perspective, this senior supervisor's actions were equivalent to betraying the Tai family and also betraying the Nutshell Engineering Department. However, this senior supervisor also had his own background. If this was really his doing, then he had now climbed up another big tree. The Federation was a place where rules were followed. The Tai family could not just drag out that supervisor and kill him. There were also no leads on the spaceship that the gunman had escaped from. Therefore, the crux of the matter now was the speed of the development of the MX mech. The Nutshell Engineering Department and Sulu had allowed for failure, but the Academy of Science had rushed to announce the success first. Sulu thought of the pressure Deputy Minister Zhou had displayed on the phone and those words he had said. He knew that he could not lose. He lowered his head and rubbed his disheveled hair. Both his feet were on the chair, but he did not express any opinion. At the same time, in the Nutshell Engineering Department not far from this backup storage, the atmosphere had also become extremely strange. More than 200 of the company's top engineers were silently looking at the large holographic screen on the ceiling. They were looking at the scene of the Federal Academy of Sciences press conference. A feeling of disappointment and defeat pervaded the air. A very long time passed, but still, no one spoke. The work that had been busy for many days also came to a temporary halt. Only a female engineer wearing cute round glasses stood up with curiosity. She stared at the beautiful yet murderous light purple mecha on the news screen. She compared it with the blueprint of the MX mecha on her workbench and found some differences. From these differences, she felt that there was something strange. Supervisor Jose knew very well that the reason Su Lo was willing to cooperate with the engineering department was because this young man had a certain stubbornness. He did not want Professor Shin's research results to be maliciously stolen by those academic bureaucrats. He also knew how much effort Su Lo had put in for this new mecha. Many sleepless days and nights had all been spent on this matter. Looking at that somewhat dejected back, he could not help but be a little worried. Would this young prodigy find it difficult to accept this result? However, right now, his mood was also unusually cold. Even if he wanted to comfort the other, he could not find any words. Just as everyone thought that Su Lo was about to break down, he slowly raised his head and turned to look at the crowd with a smile. It was not a bitter smile, but rather a smile like the radiant sun. His eyes were narrowed like two beautiful moons in the night sky, and his pearly white teeth were exposed outside his lips, as clean as the snow in Linhai. What are you all standing around for? The Federal Academy of Science is a top academic institution. Do you all think that because their technical reserves are weaker than ours, they should naturally fall behind us? Su Lo stood up, stretched, and said with a smile, "They've already announced success, so we can't just stand around. We need to hurry up and finish what we have on hand." This overly normal reaction made everyone feel that Su Lo had become somewhat abnormal under this kind of shock. Manager Jose laughed bitterly and said in a hoarse voice, "You also know that their level is higher. They've gotten ahead of us, so what we're doing is already meaningless. You should know that there can only be one standard for the new generation of mecha." In that instant when he had lowered his head, Su Lo had thought of many things. He had always felt that something was not right about this matter. He had a mature design planned personally guided by Professor Shin, and he himself had long since stopped deliberately slowing down the engineering department's research speed. Even if the data was leaked, the Academy of Science could not possibly be faster than the engineering department. On that rainy night, the other party's last attempt to stop the development of the nutshell engineering department had failed. Furthermore, if Manager Hao had really leaked part of the engineering department's progress and data, the Academy of Science would definitely feel unprecedented pressure. Pressure could sometimes be motivation, but it could also make the person in charge feel anxious and flustered, just like Manager Jose was right now. Su Lo was increasingly certain that the Federal Academy of Science must not have completed sufficient internal testing. As such, the possibility of the other party discovering that he had tampered with the core data was even lower. Thus, he was not flustered. In fact, he was even somewhat glad about the events of that rainy night and Manager Hao's leak. If not for that, he really did not have the confidence that he would be able to use those fake data to fool the other party. This is a one-sided press conference by the Academy of Science. The Federation government might not even know about it. Perhaps that Dean Lin wants to create an established fact, but the problem is that we're almost there too. How could the government not consider our side? He smiled and said to everyone, "This press conference was very well done, but I keep having this feeling that the bigger their momentum now, the more embarrassing it will be in the future." No one understood this sentence, but looking at Su Li's smiling face, for some reason, they suddenly felt a little more confident. In the small conference room on the top floor of the Ministry of National Defense building in the capital Special Administrative Region, a voice rang out. The owner of the voice was President Sieg's scientific advisor. He looked at the big shots around the round table, frowned, and said, "What exactly is the Academy of Science doing? Even Mr. President does not know about this matter, and they just held a press conference. If in the future, the experiment fails again like last autumn, who will explain it to the people of the Federation? How will the Empire view us? This scientific advisor had a good relationship with Zhou Yingxing. They had once attended Professor Shen's funeral together. For him to say something like this now naturally represented the attitude of a certain side. However, sitting in the very middle of the room, the National Security Advisor said disapprovingly, since the Academy of Science dared to hold a press conference, they naturally have confidence. As for the testing aspect, with the lesson of the nutshell incident, they will definitely be much more careful. Zhou Yingxing sat quietly in a corner of the round table. Such a meeting of the highest level of the Federation was usually held in the President's official residence, but today, because of the matter of the new MX mecha, it had been moved to the Ministry of National Defense. As the Deputy Minister of National Defense, he was not considered a key figure in such an occasion. In the past, he had rarely spoken, but today, for some reason, he looked at the document in his hands and reminded everyone in a low voice, "The engineering department's research is also nearing completion." The National Security Advisor rudely interrupted him and said sharply, "How much of the Federation's funds has the engineering department wasted in these past 10 years? In the end, all they made last year was a piece of trash that could explode. So what if their research is successful this time? Could it be that the Federation's new generation of mecha coexists with two standards? Then in the future, which standard will be used to equip the troops?" At this time, President Sieg was still inspecting South Kazhou. The person with the highest status in this meeting was naturally the National Security Advisor. This important figure's clear stance and faint dissatisfaction in his words made all the officials in the meeting think that Zhou Yingxing would be as silent as before. However, right at this time, the usually low-key Deputy Minister Zhou took off his glasses and threw them onto the table. Meeting the gaze of the National Security Advisor, he said coldly, "Of course, we'll use whichever standard is better." Chapter 240. The glasses fell on the smooth table and made a soft sound. It was a little harsh. Zhou Yingxing's cold retort at this time made everyone feel even more surprised. The most powerful political figures in the Federation were sitting in the small conference room, so naturally, they would not show this kind of surprise on their faces. They continued to look at the documents with their heads down as before, drinking tea as if they had not heard anything. However, they were all shocked and confused. They did not understand why Zhou Yingxing would jump out of his silence and confront the National Security Advisor directly. The National Security Advisor's expression was somewhat ugly. After a moment, he said calmly, "So we have to wait for Nutshell. The question is, how long do you have to wait? How long does the Federation have to wait? 3 months? Half a year? We can wait, but will those ambitious people in the Empire wait?" Everyone here should be aware that the Empire's new mecha had already been in development since 3 years ago. Although we still don't know how far they have progressed, we have to make our own preparations. If the MX is equipped to the front lines a day earlier, the Federation's brave soldiers may have one less sacrifice. I disagree with Deputy Minister Zhou's opinion. We shouldn't have to wait for too long. Zhou Yingxing calmly looked at the documents in front of him and said, "But if we don't wait and unilaterally adopt the new mecha standards of the Academy of Science, how will we appease Nutshell? As far as I know, there are hundreds of engineers and tens of thousands of workers in the engineering department who have put in years of hard work for this mecha. How long is not too long?" The National Security Advisor looked coldly at Zhou Yingxing and said, "As the President's National Security Advisor, I cannot disregard the safety of the Federation just to appease the employees of one company." The atmosphere in the conference room had long become somewhat tense. It was not common to see the Deputy Minister of Defense face to face with the National Security Advisor, so most people chose to remain silent. Even the scientific advisor, who was secretly on Zhou Yingxing's side, could not confirm how long Nutshell would take, so it was not convenient for him to offer his support. I think the nutshell should stop for now. Mr. Security Consultant looked into Zhou Yingxing's eyes and said firmly. At this moment, an official who had been sitting at the corner of the round table suddenly smiled at the crowd and said, I think we can wait for 2 more days. The people in the meeting room naturally knew that this young official was the Deputy Director of the Office of the President's Residence, Boog. As the Deputy Director of the Office of the President's Residence, his level of authority was not high, but because of his relationship with the President, he was able to attend the meeting. Could it be that he was speaking on behalf of the President? In a moment of doubt and silence, Deputy Director Boog looked at the security consultant and said politely, the key is time. It's not appropriate to wait too long. He then turned to Zhou Yingxing and asked calmly, the Department of National Defense should be monitoring the progress of the Shell Engineering Department. Can you give me a specific time? After a moment of silence, Zhou Yingxing said, 1 week. A joint meeting that appeared to be tit for tat on the surface, but which was surging in the dark, thus ended. The Federation government still had not made any specific follow-up measures in response to the explosive news from the Academy of Science. Just outside the meeting room, the security consultant dialed the President's top-secret phone number. As he silently cursed this useless idiot far away in South Dakota, his facial expression and tone simultaneously changed. Khufu. The security consultant had an extremely close relationship with President Sieg, so he directly called out the President's name. Moreover, there was a trace of friendly concern in his warm tone. Regarding the matter of the new Mecca, what exactly do you think? President Sieg's angry voice came from the other end of the phone. The Academy of Science actually released the news without informing the government. Does that Lin fellow still have any respect for me, the President? The security consultant softly comforted him and said a few words on behalf of the Federal Academy of Science. Only then did the President's anger dissipate slightly. After hanging up the phone, he touched his silver hair and could not help but shake his head. He thought to himself that this friend and student of his was really an idiot. If he had not taken care of many things for him these past few years, he was afraid that he really would have become the most laughable president in the history of the Federation. After Zhou Yingxing left the meeting room, he directly went to his office. Secretary Zhao, who had been following behind him, quickly dialed the number of the Shell Engineering Department in Hong Kong and found Su Lu. You only have 1 week, Li Yao said. Secretary Zhao thought of the tired state of the President and said in a more serious tone, the minister has already done his best. In a manor on the outskirts of the capital of Nank State, special task force agents dressed in dark suits were vigilantly watching everything that was happening outside the manor. In a room on one side of the manor, a device specifically used to monitor the electrical current noise caused by the heating of large-scale equipment was constantly working. Ever since the assassination attempt at the Linhai State Gymnasium, the big shots of the Federation realized that there were actually people in this world who were crazy enough to use military mechas to carry out assassinations. This manor was the summer retreat of the President of the Federation, so in terms of security and defense, they were naturally very cautious. Beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the manor, President Huff Sieg was looking at the scenery outside with a gloomy face. There was no trace of the anger that he had shown in the previous phone call. Some people are really messing around. The Federal Academy of Science is in a mess, and Fictional is also in a mess now. The highest leader of the Federation was known for his 2 opposite personalities, which were cowardice and anger. He had never been highly regarded in the political world, and his popularity was also very low. However, for some reason, he had already been re-elected once. The director of the office stood silently behind the President with the phone in his hand. Fictional was the National Security Advisor, the President's teacher in school, a friend, and an important figure in the government. There was no doubt that President Huff Sieg's words clearly expressed his dissatisfaction with this person. There are still a few months before my term ends, but some people are already in a hurry to find their next job. President Huff-Sieg's lips curled into a mocking smile as he said, when Senator Pabre was still a lawyer, he had already embarrassed Senal several times. His company was awarded a large sum of money. No wonder he is so nervous this time. The director of the office stood behind the president and said, "There is still a week for the show." "A week. That should be enough to satisfy that madam." President Huff-Sieg lit a thick stick of tobacco and said vaguely, "I don't care who wins or loses. As long as it's beneficial to the Federation, it's fine. Internal conflicts can't mess up external affairs. I've been resting for the Federation for 10 years just to prepare for the upcoming invasion of the Empire." "No." The president waved the tobacco in his hand. "My successor should have the courage to attack the Empire." The entire Federation was passionately discussing the new generation of the MX Mecha in the past few days. There were continuous in-depth reports on the TV and newspapers. The researchers of the Federal Academy of Science suddenly became the most popular interview guests. For the sake of confidentiality, they naturally wouldn't discuss the specific technical parameters and development process of the light purple MX Mecha. However, the possible effects of the dual engines had been thoroughly analyzed. In addition to the TV and newspapers, the various forums and microblogs on the internet also played an important role in this mecha craze. Countless military enthusiasts of the Federation spared no effort in analyzing the combat performance of the MX Mecha through the limited video data available. Countless people fantasized about the brave soldiers of the Federation operating the powerful mecha and defeating the barbaric invaders in the war against the Empire's invasion. In the blink of an eye, the patriotic passion of the Federation was fully aroused. Everyone was discussing the mecha, the dual engines, the electron jet, and other technical terms that they didn't understand before. Following this discussion, the Federal Academy of Science's position in the hearts of the people became more and more noble. Dean Lin, who led the development of the new mecha, also received unprecedented respect. In this atmosphere, even the most important autumn offensive of the presidential election was about to be forgotten by the media and the people. Only a very small number of people knew that the public support that the Federal Academy of Science gained from this incident was about to be converted into political support for the election of Ross Medellin's presidential candidate partner. On the surface, the underground nutshell engineering department of the Harbor City Industrial Park wasn't affected by this craze. All the engineers continued to follow the established schedule, silently and diligently carrying out their work. Life had to go on. Although that faint sense of disappointment still shrouded the space, as long as the Federation government didn't announce it, they would fight for it. The MX Mecha parked in the underground warehouse was nearing completion. In the isolation room, on the assembly line, countless components were being assembled. The wings were attached, and the firepower system was also beginning to be installed one by one on the body of the mecha under the fine control of the mechanical arms. After the second coating, the surface of the MX Mecha glowed with a silvery white light. Coupled with the wings on the back, it looked exceptionally beautiful. Beautiful, but it could be forgotten by the entire Federation. Sulu rubbed his dry eyes and licked his dry lips. He looked at the MX Mecha in front of him with more confidence than anyone else. It was at this moment that two words suddenly appeared on the gray holographic screen of the workbench. "Hello." Sulu was slightly taken aback. He narrowed his eyes and stared at the two small words. Shock grew in his heart. This was the workbench that he had spent a great deal of effort to set up. It could block all wireless communications. How could someone hack into the workbench and send him a signal? Could it be that existence he didn't want to think of again, and wanted to chat with him out of boredom? The intruder didn't frighten Sulu for too long. A second line of small words immediately appeared. I've done a comparison of the components. I feel that some of the designs of the mecha from the Academy of Science are better. Would you like to take a look? Chapter 241. After seeing this sentence, Su Li's nervousness was mostly relieved. The terrifying existence who had forced its way into his dreams the last few times had appeared to be omnipotent despite not knowing where it had come from. Although he had no clues to grasp, using his engineer's logic, he had already deduced that if the other party was not the Bureau of Proclamation, then it was the Federal Central Computer under the Bureau of Proclamation. This was a possibility that terrified him so much that he did not want to think about it. Earlier, when he had seen the sudden appearance of that line of words on the workbench, he had immediately thought of that great existence who called himself the Old Thing. However, he then remembered that the other party could directly invade his brain to talk to him, so why would they use this method? Moreover, although that existence had also very politely addressed him with the word, "Sir," in those dark dream characters, it was ultimately not as mundane and real as the words on the workbench right now. Su Li thought for a moment, and decided not to tell Supervisor Jose about someone invading his workbench. He quickly analyzed the situation in his mind. The workbench was currently connected to the engineering department's internal network, and the underground department of the engineering department was not completely cut off from the Federation's network. The person who had invaded his workbench must be within the engineering department, and judging from the other party's words, it did not seem like they had any ill intentions. He typed into the GE conversation software window, "Who are you?" The other side of the conversation window was silent for a while, and then a line of words appeared, "Please do not panic. I am a technician from the engineering department. Because I could not find a way to contact you, I invaded your workbench." Su Li scratched his head, more or less understanding the other's meaning. Although many people in the upper echelons of the Federation knew that he had helped the Nutshell Engineering Department, at the other levels, his participation in the development of the MX Mecha was still top secret. Supervisor Jose had tight control over the engineering department, so even though he had been working with those mature and experienced engineers of the engineering department for so many days, the people in the engineering department still did not know who was helping them even though the straight-line distance between them was less than 1 kilometer. It looked like that technician on the other side had really discovered some problem and was in a hurry to contact that mysterious support team in the backup storeroom. He did not have the authority to go through the proper channels, so he had used this method. However, Su Li was a little wary of the other party's technical means. They were actually able to infiltrate his workstation through the engineering department's intranet. It's normal if the Academy of Sciences design is better than ours. He typed on the screen. Is there a problem? The other side sent over a compressed image package, which was then displayed on the holographic screen. After the press conference at the Academy of Science, I took a screenshot of some comparative drawings. There are some problems in them, so I'll send them to you for a look. Su Li opened the compressed package, propped up his head, and began to carefully read the very clearly marked blueprints. At first, he didn't know what the other party meant, but after carefully reading the notes and side notes, he roughly understood that the other party should have discovered some problems with the Federal Academy of Sciences MX design. The main difference between the two design ideas was in the angle of fine adjustment of the electron jets behind the twin engines. That engineer had only calculated this angle by comparing the blueprints and calculating the ratio of the armor behind the waist of the Federal Academy of Sciences MX Mecha. This angle was not some particularly important data. The problem was that this engineer who had infiltrated Su Li's workstation was able to calculate the difference in the TT31 formula in the quantum measurable dynamic core data and function model used by the Federal Academy of Science and the Engineering Department just based on this difference in angle. Su Li narrowed his eyes as he looked at these calculation results, but the shock in the depths of his heart could not be any greater. The data that the Federal Academy of Science had snatched from his hands had originally been tampered with through that great being. Therefore, the other party's modification design for the electron jets being somewhat different was something that he had long expected. What shocked him was that this unknown engineer was actually able to calculate so many things just from the appearance of the purple MX at the press conference. This should be what a true genius is, right? He stared blankly at the numbers on the holographic screen. Very complicated emotions welled up in his heart. On one hand, he admired that engineer, but on the other hand, he was worried that this engineer's findings would interfere with his plans. The streamlined silver-white MX mecha was not far in front of him. Those complicated power devices and firepower systems had long been installed. The finely designed attachment wings had also begun to calibrate their interfaces. The engineering department's small production line was currently creating interfaces that could be quickly replaced. Su-Lo scratched his head and raised his head. Looking at the scene in front of him, he thought of that genius engineer and remained silent. The entire Shell engineering department treated the data and function model he had brought as the most important thing, but Su-Lo understood that this was only because the Federation's academic community had not done much research in the field of quantum dynamic measurability these past few years. The Shell Motor Corporation engineering department had worked hard for this silver-white MX mecha for more than 10 years. The majority of the work had already been completed. It was only because of the failure of the experiment last autumn that they needed his help. Because the engine inlet had to be modified, Su-Lo had participated in the final assembly design this time. However, the ones who had truly solved the problem were still those outstanding and nameless engineers in the engineering department. Only the engineers of the Shell engineering department were the true contributors to the creation of the MX mecha. They were amazing giants. Su-Lo knew that he was only standing on the shoulders of a giant, helping him pick out a wooden spike that had pierced his earlobe to cause him pain. Your judgment is correct. The function models used by our two sides are different. Su-Lo was silent for a long time before he typed, but please keep this matter confidential. Confidential. The reply from the other side was very quick. Is this a disciplinary requirement? If so, of course it will be kept confidential. However, I still feel that the design from the Academy of Science seems to be better. Su-Lo knew how to explain this problem. He typed, "Can I meet you?" He forcefully changed the topic. He had originally thought that the other side would maintain a sense of mystery, or that they would not be willing to reveal their identity at all. Unexpectedly, the reply from the other side was even faster, and there were many emojis that represented excitement in the characters. Of course you can. I've always been very curious about where this mysterious team of yours came from. I've asked the people in the Research Institute to help me find out. Recently, no one from the Research Institute has been transferred over by the engineering department. These ordinary words hid excitement and desire. Su-Lo had no idea that he had long become a great mystery in the engineering department, so he could not understand the other's excitement. Open the video on your side and go through the security clearance, the engineer typed. Su-Lo did as he was told and opened the clearance. Then, he saw the color block in the dialog box begin to change. It went from blurry to clear, and then the scene on the other side appeared. He rubbed his eyes. He did not understand why the first thing he saw in the video was an extremely elastic pillow pressed together by someone's hand, revealing a deep cleavage. The deep cleavage moved and moved back. Gradually, the whole image came into view. Su-Lee's face turned slightly red. Only then did he realize that the first thing he saw was actually a girl's extremely full chest. The female engineer on the other side of the video was not very old. Her delicate face was filled with a pair of curious eyes, and a pair of large glasses made her eyes look even cuter. Her black hair was haphazardly tied up with a pen, and she wore a white work uniform. The uniform was not fastened, revealing a light yellow tight vest underneath. When Su-Lo saw the pair of glasses, he was stunned. When he saw the other person's face, he sighed softly in his heart. Then, his eyes were immediately attracted by the tight curves of the light yellow vest. Previously, he was a little surprised by the female engineer's voluptuous figure. Now, when he saw the other person's outfit and age, he felt that this combination was too abrupt. He had only opened the security clearance that allowed the video signal to enter, so the other person should not be able to see his current actions. However, Sulu still felt a little embarrassed. He tilted his head, but less than a second later, he could not help but stare curiously at the girl's chest in the video. Although Uncle Feng Yu did not succeed in bringing him into the world of cosmetics, he had cultivated a habit of looking at beautiful women on the street. Not to mention, at this time, in the heavily guarded underground of the engineering department, he could see the most attractive part of a girl's body at such a close distance. After all, he was still a young man, and it was difficult for him to resist this temptation. "My name is Shang Qiu." The girl smiled and introduced herself. "I'm a technician from the engineering department. Mr. Jose has been hiding you guys very well. I'm really curious about who can come up with these structural blueprints. You have to know that since last autumn, I have been working on the electronic jet modification work, but my progress is much slower than yours." Sulu looked at this female engineer named Shang Qiu, scratched his head, and turned his head around uneasily. He thought about how he thought this person was a genius, and in his heart, he guessed that technical geniuses were probably idiots in life. Otherwise, they would definitely notice how her voluptuous breasts would cause trouble to the person on the other side of the video. He thought about it and sent a message to the other side, saying, "Engineer Shang, can you adjust the video a bit?" As soon as he sent this message, he heard an angry objection from beside him. Major Lan Xiaolong stared at Sulu very gloomily and said, "Hypocrite. Such big breasts, and she's an engineer with glasses. How can you not take a second look?" Sulu was stunned. Only then did he notice that those people had already walked up to his side at some point. That Major Lan Xiaolong, who was in charge of protecting him, was staring fixedly at the screen, while Bai Yulan was standing to one side with her hands folded in her sleeves. Meanwhile, Zhou Yu was looking at him with a strange expression. "There's no need to keep it a secret anymore. The engineering department has been guessing at your identity for a long time now, even going so far as to make a few calls." Supervisor Jose came to the side of the group and said with a smile, "The Shang Qiu who invaded your workbench is the most famous technical fanatic in the engineering department, and also my most capable subordinate. She is the most eccentric technician in the engineering department, and also the most impressive. Generally speaking, we all think of her as a freak. The final design of the MX Mecha was largely due to her contributions." Zhou Yu shrugged and added, "Of course, now I feel that you're a bit more of a freak than her." Major Lan Xiaolong reluctantly watched the video move from the voluptuous breasts to Shang Qiu's face, and said seriously, "I only know that this is definitely the technician with the biggest breasts in the Nutshell engineering department." Just as Zhou Yu had said, Sulu had joined the research and development team of the Nutshell engineering department, restarting the final repair work of the MX Mecha. These past few days, the two sides had not met each other, but they had worked together with great rapport. This caused the hundreds of technicians in the engineering department to develop a trace of admiration and endless curiosity towards the technical support team in the backup storeroom. They did not know when such an outstanding technical team had appeared in the Federation. However, since they were engaged in a confidential business, naturally not many people would ask about it. Even if they did, with Supervisor Jose and Zhou Yu's protective nature, they would not tell them. Therefore, speculations about this mysterious technical team gradually spread. Many people believed that it was those old professors from the Research Institute, some believed that it was the Federal Academy of Science that had come to provide support for the overall benefit of the Federation, and some believed that it was the Board of Directors that had invited those researchers from Guzhong Corporation. After all, Guzhong Corporation's multi-engine technology was ahead of the rest of the Federation. Many people knew about the conflict that had occurred on that rainy night, but that incident only added to the mystery surrounding those people in the backup storeroom. A technical team that was qualified to be carefully protected by the active Federal Army, just by imagining it, one would feel that it was somewhat unfathomable. Shang Qiu was a female doctorate graduate from the capital university. Just like Su Lu, she was also an abnormal human who did not have a background in the mechanical department of the top 3 schools, but had successfully entered the nutshell. However, her abnormality was mainly reflected in her superhuman IQ, as well as her fanatical research into mechanical technology. She did not believe that this mysterious team had come from the Research Institute, the Academy of Science, or the Guzhong Corporation. This was because any design would always have its own theoretical support and style. However, the modification of the electron jets by this mysterious team was completely based on the research of quantum measurable dynamics. This was especially true for the final few sets of structural design concepts, which were even more difficult to understand. They were very different from the usual conventions of the Federation's academic community. Shang Qiu was not a technical member of the Academy, so she very keenly deduced that this mysterious technical support team, or at least the spiritual core of the team, should have come from an unorthodox background just like herself. In these past few days of work, Shang Qiu had been looking at the data, instructions, and blueprints sent over from the backup storeroom. She had developed a strong sense of admiration and recognition towards the technical prowess of this mysterious team from the depths of her heart. She was a technical fanatic, so when she found that someone had gone further than her and was at a higher level, she could not help but develop the desire to learn from them. Unfortunately, the discipline of the engineering department was strict. As the technical supervisor, she had to set an example. Thus, these past few days, she could only forcefully suppress the curiosity in her heart and wait for the day when the final results would be announced. She could only watch as the Federal Academy of Science rushed to announce the new mecha. After using her computer to perform countless calculations and comparisons of blueprints, she confirmed that there was something strange about this matter. No matter what kind of woman she was, she would always need a reason to do something. Shang Qiu found a very good reason, and then added on the excuse that she was temporarily unable to contact Supervisor Jose and that she was pressed for time. Thus, she brazenly hacked into the workbench in the backup storeroom and began her conversation with those mysterious people. This was the first conversation between Shang Qiu and Su Lu. Neither of the two parties involved in the conversation would have expected that from then on, this conversation about technology would run through the rest of their lives. And from a certain perspective, it would also change their lives and affect the lives of many others. If it's not a breach of confidentiality regulations, can you reveal a little? What's your name? How many people are in your team, and where are you from? Who is your technical supervisor? Shang Qiu typed rapidly on the keyboard as she asked curiously, completely oblivious to the fact that as she moved, her bulging breasts, tightly wrapped by her yellow singlet, appeared even more alluring. The other side of the conversation box was silent for a moment before responding, "My name is Su Lu. I'm from Whitewater Company. Our team. I don't know how many people there are. If we include Zhou Yu and Mr. Jose, then it's 4 people. We don't have a technical supervisor, but if you want to discuss the previous question, you can talk to me directly." Shang Qiu looked at these words and couldn't help but be stunned. She didn't believe the other side's answer. How could those low-level technical supervisors in Whitewater Security Company be able to create these things? And according to what the other side said, in fact, this team only had 2 people. She rubbed her somewhat tight forehead and pushed up the glasses that were about to fall down the bridge of her nose. Her action was particularly cute, and she asked seriously, "Su Gong, is what you said true? Then you really are a peerless genius." The people in the conversation didn't see that this female engineer had already begun to quietly operate her computer. She entered a few commands and hacked into the other side's workbench again. Without alerting any of the defense systems, she activated the other side's video capture device. Su Lu was a little embarrassed. He thought to himself that this female engineer was able to hack into the workbench and discover the problem in such a short time. In fact, he was only able to do all this by relying on Professor Shin's legacy and the structural blueprint in the dark dream. In a sense, he was just a cheater. Receiving such praise really made him feel a little embarrassed. At this time, Shang Qiu had quietly remotely activated the video capture system of the workbench in the backup warehouse. Then, her expression suddenly became strange. This was because she confirmed that this guy named Su Lo was telling the truth. On the screen was a young face with a trace of shyness and awkwardness. And behind the young man were manager Jose and Zhou Yu. Further to the side was a pervert in a military uniform who looked abnormally disgusting. Shang Qiu subconsciously lowered her head and glanced at her chest. Then, she looked up and said, "Are my breasts very big?" The person on the other side of the screen didn't know why she said that, nor did he know that she was monitoring him. Su Lo was stunned for a moment. Of course, he wasn't stupid enough to type the words, "very big breasts." He just nodded subconsciously. Behind him, Major Lan Xiaolong was about to nod his head off. Even manager Jose and Zhou Yu couldn't help but smile and shrug their shoulders after looking at each other. Shang Qiu smiled and typed, "Big breasts don't mean no brain. Get that stinking soldier out of here." When this sentence came out, everyone's body froze. Chapter 242. Conscience is when we are aware of the existence of the court of morality within us. No matter what method we choose to use to live in this universe, perhaps we can find a path for rats to crawl through in the radiance of the charter, perhaps we can turn the legal provisions into those yellowed papers and scattered electronic data, but when we grow old, we will always have to look back and see the verdict of the court of morality within us. People, there has never been a truly harmonious world, there is no absolute fairness, but everyone walks the path of harmony and fairness. Perhaps some people will break the wooden stick and drive away the beasts on the road, but perhaps in the next moment, that wooden stick will become a job for us to bully our companions. Deep within everyone's heart, there will be a beast. What we need to do is to throw away those wooden sticks and use a non-beastly method to deal with the disputes between us. George Carlin said that the greatest injustice in the Federation society is the unfair possession of information by different classes. This is a simple and thought-provoking judgment. People, please think about it. How much do we know about the things in the Federation? Are the things we know true? Are the things we know what some people want us to know? If there is no true sharing of information, then when we deal with the disputes between us, will we already be in a state of inequality? Will we angrily pick up the wooden stick in our hands again? People, we need change. What we need is not a change on the surface, but a change on the deepest level. From the pond of the past, there will be no fish that wants to jump out of the pond. Thinking deeper from the sharing of information, I often associate it with that ordinary building in the suburbs of the capital, that one-way road. I am thinking about how the radiance of the Charter protects the hundreds of millions of people in the Federation to live in a peaceful environment, but do we need to make some corresponding changes? Of course, this should be a matter for many years to come. People, change in the Federation is right before your eyes, and the ones who can push for this change and make this change a reality are you, and only you. The autumn of the 67th year of the constitutional calendar has already arrived, and the votes are being printed under the supervision of the election committee. Your fingers will decide everything. I am Senator Medellin from Region S2. I have come to the pond that is the Federation. I want to make a change, and I need you to vote for me and Governor Ross. This is a sincere and direct request. It had been a few days since Xiao Wenjing had been transferred from the second branch of the district procurator's office. He knew that it was probably because of the aftermath of the murder case at the entrance of Hushan Road. This office was located in a building next to Charter Square. This building was a foreign office of the Federal Justice Department. Until today, he only knew that this office should belong to the Investigation and Law Enforcement Department. However, he did not understand why the recent documents sent to the office seemed to be applications for the appointment of an independent prosecutor by the Federal Management Committee. There were no cases that required independent investigation in the Federation recently. Since he had nothing else to do, he picked up the newspaper in his hand and continued to flip through it, preparing to finish reading Senator Medellin's column. As an inspector of the Federation, he had seen countless dirty deals within the Federation, but he still retained his faith in the judiciary and his love for the system. He was not a person who liked to participate in politics, but he had some feelings for Senator Macklin's article. This was already the 17th article that Senator Macklin had published in the Capital Daily. Since the terrorist attack at the S2 concert in mountainous 4 states, Senator Macklin had used this method to communicate with the voters of the Federation. This former second-in-command of the anti-government army was indeed a political figure recognized by the people of the Federation as St. George's disciple. The 17 political articles included all aspects of the Federation's political and economic life. The language was simple and easy to understand. On one hand, he described the political views of Ross's presidential candidate and himself. On the other hand, he called for the entire Federation to continue on the path of reconciliation and nonviolence. Ordinary language, coupled with this senator's legendary political experience, began to reveal an extremely attractive power. When the first 16 political articles were published, the people of the Federation fought to read them. It was not convenient for the scholars and professors in the academic world to express their opinions, but it was said that they also admired Senator Macklin in private. As a returnee, a member of the opposition, he was very clear about the shortcomings of the Federation's political scene. At the same time, he was able to use this kind of rational attitude to propose reforms. He was not blindly radical. Today was the 17th political article, and also the last one. Senator Macklin changed his usual calm and gentle tone and began to use more eye-catching words and provocative tones. With the concrete thoughts of the first 16 articles as a foundation, this last concluding speech was full of vigor and determination. It does feel a little hot-blooded. This counselor actually dares to mention the reform of the Charter Bureau. He is really bold. Xiao Wenjing put down the newspaper in his hand, crossed his legs, and began to browse the interesting articles on the internet. In the past few days, he was like the average citizen of the Federation, mainly downloading the beautiful blueprints of the MX mecha named Purple Sea. Right at this moment, a notification flashed on the screen. He stood up, tidied up his inspector uniform, and headed upstairs to the office. After entering the office, he saw the appearance of the middle-aged inspector in front of the office. He could not help but be stunned. After a moment's hesitation, he said, "Teacher." The middle-aged inspector's eyes were sunken, his expression solemn. When he heard this form of address, he raised his head and said, "I am now an independent inspector personally appointed by the Minister of Justice." Xiao Wenjing immediately understood. There must be a big case in the Federation. Otherwise, the Minister of Justice would not have let his teacher come out of the academy to take over. He was stunned for a moment before recalling that he had been transferred to this department. Could it be that his teacher had started taking over this case a long time ago? That was why he had been transferred here to help. But the question was, why had he not heard anything about this before? What case is it? He walked up to the independent inspector's desk. On the desk was a small sword that represented the Federation's law and justice. Do you still have confidence in the Federation's law? The middle-aged inspector raised his head and looked at his most valued student. He knew better than anyone else the embarrassing role played by the Prosecutor General's office in the murder case at Tiger Mountain Road. He also knew the student's current state of mind, so he did not answer his question. Instead, he asked such a question. Xiao Wenjing glanced at the small sword on the desk and said very seriously, "Yes." "Well, I can tell you. The case that the Minister of Justice has authorized me to independently investigate is related to Senator Macklin. There are a total of 17 crimes waiting for this senator, the middle-aged inspector said expressionlessly. When Xiao Wenjing heard the name Senator Macklin, heard the 17 crimes, and then connected it to the 17 political articles, he subconsciously thought of many things. A hint of boredom and disgust flashed in his eyes. He said with a slight self-deprecating tone, "The Federation's political schemes are really endless." The middle-aged inspector was not surprised by this student's reaction. This was because when the Minister of Justice first notified him, he also had the same thoughts. Now, Senator Macklin was assisting Governor Ross in the presidential election, but at this time, the Federation government wanted to investigate him. If it was said that there was no political conspiracy involved, no one would believe it. Just finish reading these materials in my office before you express your opinion. He frowned and reprimanded, an inspector should have his own independent judgment, and not be blinded by the so-called public opinion and external image. This is the first lesson I taught you. Have you forgotten? Xiao Wenjing bowed his head and admitted his mistake. He walked in front of the computer and began to seriously look at the materials that had been organized into 4 files. The more he looked, the more shocked he was. He could not believe his eyes. Senator Macklin, who was famous in the Federation for his nonviolent views, was actually the mastermind behind so many terrorist attacks. As an extremely professional inspector, Xiao Wenjing did not spend much time to determine that these materials were definitely not used by someone to frame Senator Macklin. At this time, of course, he did not know that these materials were collected by an excellent spy named Shi Qinghai, who spent countless nights to collect the information. He only subconsciously thought that if these things were verified, the entire Federation would usher in a great shock. After an unknown amount of time, Xiao Wenjing finally finished reading these shocking materials. His eyebrows gradually furrowed. The presidential candidate, after being registered by the election committee, has temporary jurisdiction. He looked at his teacher worriedly. These materials can only be used in a reasonable way, but they cannot be used to help with the prosecution. What is your judgment? The middle-aged inspector did not answer the question. Instead, he asked directly. I think that Senator Macklin is very suspicious. Xiao Wenjing once again organized the materials in his mind and said very seriously. Senator Macklin has jurisdiction, so the investigation can only be carried out in secret. The Ministry of Justice has already granted the authority, but now the Federation Management Committee will not approve the application to set up an independent inspector, so I am also a temporary guy. Xiao Wenjing understood the main work that had been done in this organization a few days ago. You have the authority to mobilize the police department, the Federation administration's resources. The middle-aged inspector looked at him and said, if there is no evidence, you have to find the evidence. Don't forget, we are the Federation, and he is only a suspect. No matter how experienced a politician is, he will never be able to hide in front of the law. Do you have this confidence? Yes, Xiao Wenjing replied. Very good. The middle-aged inspector smiled and glanced at Senator Macklin's political column in the newspaper from the corner of his eyes. He said softly, I don't know if this vice presidential candidate has a moral court in his heart, but I want to remind him that the Federation has a real court. Xiao Wenjing nodded, but he knew in his heart that if Senator Macklin was really elected as the Federation's vice president, with the efficiency and decentralization of the Federation Management Committee, it would definitely be impossible to pass an impeachment bill or an independent investigation bill. At least during his term, it would be difficult for the Ministry of Justice to continue this investigation, and Senator Macklin would be very safe. At this time, he suddenly realized that the vote in his hand was also very important at the same time, on Carbine Street, where the major media gathered in the Capital Special District. An argument that was much more intense than the one in the Ministry of Justice broke out in the editor-in-chief's office inside a building. The editorial department of the Capital Daily News had this kind of drama all year round, just like the profound lunar eclipse pattern outside the newspaper office building. There was no such thing as perfect peace. I need a reason. You have to give me a reason today. I found 3 reporters and 17 paparazzi, spent 70,000 Federation coins, and finally verified a little bit of the anonymous information. It was written into a block of tofu with a few hundred words, and you actually suppressed it. And suppressed it 3 times in a row. Mr. Wood, the senior political reporter of the Capital Daily News, looked at the editor-in-chief angrily and roared, "Mr. Bob, what exactly do you want to do? Don't tell me that because you don't want to offend politicians, you have become a piece of trash who has forgotten the rules of journalism." The editor-in-chief Bob glanced at the closed glass door and confirmed that the conversation between him and his old partner would not be heard by anyone. He was slightly relieved. He was silent for a moment, shook his head with a bitter smile, and said, "Wood, don't forget that I am also a reporter, and I am the chief reporter of the Capital Daily News. I know the purpose of the Daily News better than anyone else. The half-eclipsed moon outside is constantly reminding us, but you still can't publish this report. We need to find out the reason why the moon is half-eclipsed." This is a famous quote that the journalists said when they wanted to break through the government's blockade when the Federation opened up the Donglin region. Mr. Wood sat down with a sullen face and said, "You are not even afraid of the government's pressure. I don't understand. Do you want to watch a politician who deceives the world and gains fame by playing with the anti-government army and the voters of the Federation become a vice president? The problem is that your investigation has no real evidence." The editor-in-chief Bob frowned and said, "You know very well how much pressure the newspaper office has to bear when such a report comes out. The key problem now is that we are not facing the government, but a politician who is deeply respected by the voters of the Federation. We have to be careful in seeking confirmation. Being careful in seeking confirmation is the job of a scientist. Journalists only need to report what they find objectively. As for what readers will associate and discover from these news facts, that is not a problem we should be concerned about." Wood directly cut him off. "Our newspaper office has always been known for being fair and objective." The editor-in-chief also began to get angry. He slammed the table and shouted, "But now you want to use this report to influence the presidential election, and it is a candidate from the opposition, without any real evidence. What will the entire Federation think of our newspaper? Will they think that you or I just published the report based on the self-awareness of a journalist? They will only think that we were pressured by certain forces in the Federation to act as the thugs of the politicians to suppress an old man who has no foundation in the Federation and who has just entered the management committee less than 2 years ago, who advocates nonviolence." This was a very long paragraph. After Bob finished speaking, he was also a bit out of breath. He took a sip of coffee and said in a hoarse voice, "If you can find real evidence, I will agree to your report even if I have to give up my position as editor-in-chief. But if you can't find it, I can't agree. It is precisely because our newspaper is known for being fair and objective in the Federation that the informant gave us such important information." Mr. Wood was no longer as agitated as before. He said with a trace of pain, "I understand what you mean, but we are only journalists. If even we can investigate the matter behind Senator Macklin, then what is the use of the Ministry of Justice? What is the use of the judges? We are only the explorers of the facts. Those facts are right on your table. If we can't report these, how can we face the trust of the brave informant? There are many kinds of facts. Different ways of writing will give readers different impressions after reading them," the editor-in-chief said tiredly. "I can't take this risk. If the readers of the entire Federation think that we have become thugs for the politicians, who will be responsible for the reputation of this newspaper that has lasted for thousands of years? I will try my best to be objective. You don't have to say any more." The editor-in-chief looked at his colleague who had entered the newspaper with him and said with a frown, don't forget, the person you are investigating is very likely to be the next vice president. According to the latest poll, the support for Ross and his partner is approaching that of Senator Pawbray. And according to my sources, this afternoon, there will be a heavyweight bomb thrown at Ross and Macklin. At this time, we, a newspaper, can't expect to be able to change the attitude of the Federation voters. Reporter Wood was silent for a long time. Suddenly, he asked, "Did the board of directors give you any hints?" The Capital Daily News was funded by an institution under the Sandlin United Bank. The Sandlin United Bank belonged to the Leaf family, one of the 7 families in the Federation. The Leaf family was a strong supporter of Ross and Macklin in this presidential election. For these reporters who had been in the news industry for many years, these things were no secret. Seeing that the unfavorable report on Senator Macklin had been suppressed, Wood naturally thought of this. The editor-in-chief, Bob, looked at him coldly. After a long time, he said, "You underestimate me." Wood was silent for a moment. He believed that the editor-in-chief was not such a person. He said, "Sorry, I am a little emotional today. It's not that I don't want you to report, but I need an opportunity. The most famous method of a news reporter is to beat the dog that is in the water. We don't need hypocritical pity." The editor-in-chief, Bob, sighed and said softly, "Senator Macklin hasn't fallen into the water yet. It's not the right time for us to make a move." Wood understood the editor-in-chief's meaning. He sighed and said, "The problem is that the autumn election is about to begin. Where can we find the right time? I believe there must be one." Bob said to himself in his heart. He looked at the column of Senator Macklin's political opinion in his newspaper. Suddenly, a trace of disgust surged in his heart. He threw the newspaper into the wastepaper basket. He looked up at the respected reporter, Wood, and said calmly, "If the court of the Federation doesn't work by then, and the court of ethics in Senator Macklin's heart doesn't work, then our newspaper will have to become his court of ethics. Although this is a very inappropriate way of doing things." Chapter 243. It was not autumn between August and September, but the drizzling rain in Harbor City washed away the heat and soothed the smell of dust. Then, with the cold wind blowing from the north, the air began to cool and clean, adding a hint of autumn to it. Suluk stood on the platform of the Industrial Park building, squinting his eyes as he looked at the blurry watercolor-like scenery of the city on the other side of the drizzling autumn rain. He subconsciously raised his hand and took a puff of a 37 brand cigarette. The cigarette entered his throat and lungs. It was a little spicy, but also a little sweet, just like his mood at the moment. Yesterday afternoon, in the bustling city of Harbor City, the election of Governor Ross and Senator Medellin had carried out a huge campaign. The people who came to participate were not afraid of the cold autumn rain, and the number of people reached more than 200,000. During that campaign, Dean Lin of the Federal Academy of Science finally stood on the stage. In his decades of academic career, this was the first time he expressed his views on politics, and he called on the Federation voters to support Ross and Senator Medellin. Suluk could not remember the reason that Dean Lin of the Academy of Sciences used. It was mostly that he yearned for peace, and every contribution he made to the Federation was to resist the invasion of the Empire, to unite the people of the Federation, and that Governor Ross and Senator Medellin were presidential candidates that he believed to be trustworthy, and so on. The Federal Academy of Science, which had a high status in the hearts of the Federation citizens, expressed its views on the presidential election for the first time. Whether this was in accordance with the election laws of the Federation was not something that many people cared about, because Senator Pawbray would not be able to fight a constitutional lawsuit at this time. The key was that the effect had already been seen. After the Academy of Sciences announced the successful development of the MX Mecha, its position in the hearts of the Federation citizens improved. The bias that Dean Lin announced had a huge impact on the psychology of the voters. According to the latest Federation TV poll, Ross and Senator Medellin had for the first time surpassed Senator Pobre in terms of public support. Sulu narrowed his eyes at the sudden desolate autumn scene, but he didn't feel too much sorrow in his heart. However, he was wondering why the things that Shi Qinghai had passed his secretary Shen through him hadn't been exposed at this time of the presidential election. Could it be that Lady Tai was so confident in Pobre that she didn't want to resort to such means? In a sense, Shi Qinghai and Su Lo were just small fries. However, these two small fries were constantly trying to achieve great things. Su Lo didn't know if he could succeed. He only knew that if someone like Senator Macklin were to stand at the peak of the Federation's power, the Federation, which was already somewhat corrupt, would become even more unacceptable. He put the cigarette to his lips with 2 fingers and took a deep breath. He asked softly, "Is the result not out yet?" Shang Qiu was wearing a gray work uniform and standing quietly beside him. She was looking at something below the rooftop. There were still some raindrops on her huge glasses. When she heard this, she knew that the young man beside her was not as calm as he appeared to be. She lowered her head and answered, "We have done what we should do. Whether we can pass the final test or not is up to God." Since the video call that day, because there was no longer a need to keep it a secret, the engineers of the Nutshell Engineering Department knew the true identity of the mysterious technical team in the backup storage room. They were shocked that there was only one person in the team. Engineer Shang Qiu came directly to the backup storage room and started working with Su Lu. They didn't know what Su Lu said to Shang Qiu, but this genius female engineer didn't ask about the error in the core data anymore. Maybe she knew the truth, so other than the two of them, no one else knew about the secret of the new MX machine named Purple Sea from the Federal Academy of Science. They were both engineers with extraordinary talents. From the beginning, Su Lu and Shang Qiu's communication was very smooth. No matter what idea he came up with, this female engineer seemed to be able to use the current technology of the Federation to find a way to realize it. And every time Shang Qiu came up with a vague idea, Su Lu could use his knowledge, the ideas taught by the uncle, and the complicated blueprints in his mind to give her some inspiration. This kind of extremely tacit cooperation had actually started a long time ago, before the two of them had even met. Shang Qiu had always been in charge of the finalization of the MX mecha. Su Li's work in the underground of the engineering department these past few days was mainly to cooperate with this girl. However, he hadn't known about this at the start. Shang Qiu also hadn't expected that the technical support team in the backup storage room would actually be someone younger than herself. The air on the rooftop was somewhat chilly. Shang Qiu tightened the work uniform draped over her body, her arms crossed in front of her chest, which squeezed the dizzying whiteness of her breasts even more. Su Lu had long gotten used to this female engineer's figure, so he was no longer as nervous and stunned as before. After a brief pause, he passed a cigarette to her and said, "I can't be as calm as you. I'm faking it." Shang Qiu moved to his side and lit the cigarette. The reddish end of the cigarette trembled in the autumn wind. She exhaled the smoke somewhat shakily, coughed twice, and said, "After I graduated from Metropolis University, I entered the engineering department. The first and last job I took on was the MX mecha. In truth, this is the only thing I've done in my life. Today, I'll know whether this thing will succeed or not. Of course I'm a little nervous." Su Lu glanced at her, took a deep drag on his cigarette, and extinguished it in the water stains on the railing. He said, "I'm also very nervous." The profession of an engineer was different from that of a warship commander. It was still a male-dominated world. This was determined by the difference in the thought patterns and interest of the sexes in metal and machinery. He thought to himself, Shang Qiu had been able to enter the core department to research the MX mecha as soon as she graduated from Metropolis University. Moreover, in just a few short years, she had risen from a normal technician to the present technical supervisor. Her ability had already been amply proven. The Federation government had given the Nutshell Engineering Department a week's time. Today was the last day. No matter how many ideas the hundreds of engineers in the engineering department still had to be tested, or how much finishing work they still had to do, a result had to be produced today. In fact, when Su Lu and Shang Qiu were smoking on the rooftop, it was precisely when the DoD General Assembly base officers were coming to the engineering department to conduct a joint inspection. Success and failure would be determined in these few short hours. Just as Shang Qiu had said earlier, what they needed to do had already been done. There was no point in staying in the storeroom any longer. Thus, they simply left the storeroom and came to the rooftop to bask in the autumn rain and scenery. It was as if this was the only way to leave that tense and stifling atmosphere. Speaking of which, it was very strange. The engineering department's MX Mecha was currently undergoing inspection, but the two most important and crucial engineers were hiding outside, not thinking or daring to care about those things at all. Almost at the same time, Mr. Jose's voice rang out from Su Lu and Shang Qiu's communicators. The two of them exchanged a look, and from the other's eyes, they both found that Mr. Jose's tone did not reveal anything. This pair of young geniuses very tacitly wiped away the rainwater on their foreheads and walked silently into the building. When they reached the entrance of the building, Su looked through the extinguished cigarette butt into the dustbin. Shang Qiu paused for a moment, and then did the same. The two of them followed the passageway into the backup storeroom. In the past, the storeroom was abnormally spacious and quiet, with only the sound of assembly lines and mechanical arms. Today, however, it was abnormally lively, because many people had come. Although those people were all standing in place at the moment, not whispering to each other, this atmosphere made Su Lu feel a little uncomfortable. He looked at the silver-white MX Mecha on the platform in the distance, and then at the seemingly small figures below the tall mecha. He narrowed his eyes. The director of the Ministry of National Defense's General Assembly base had come, and so had the CEO of the Shell Motor Company. There were also many technical personnel from the military and the Research Institute. These people were all wearing dustproof and radiation-resistant work clothes, goggles, and full equipment. They looked just like battleship maintenance personnel walking in space. It was impossible to tell their identities and positions. Su Lu looked at those fully covered test officers, and could not help but think of himself and the others smoking, eating, and exercising in front of the MX Mecha. He could not help but smile. As he walked down the metal stairs, Secretary Bai and Major Lan Xiaolong silently came up behind him. One was his personal secretary, while the other was a soldier under the orders of the Ministry of National Defense to protect the safety of others. Naturally, they would not be too far away from him. Major Lan Xiaolong looked at Shang Qiu beside Su Lu, and raised an eyebrow, a hint of ambiguity in his eyes. Bai Yulan, on the other hand, maintained her calm and ladylike expression, her head slightly lowered. Su Lu did not ask about the results of the inspection, because since Mr. Jose had informed him, the results would have to wait at the front. Su Lu and Shang Qiu walked towards the MX Mecha. The sound of their footsteps was not loud, but it was exceptionally clear in the storeroom. The officers who had been talking in front of the mecha heard Mr. Jose say a few words, and then turned to look at the young man and woman, seeming somewhat surprised. A loud metallic clang drowned out the sound of their footsteps. The passageway between the backup storeroom and the engineering department had been completely opened, and that extremely thick and heavy alloy wall had been moved to another location. The engineers who had previously been at the engineering department headquarters to cooperate with the inspection work all walked over from the other side to join the people in the storeroom. These engineers carried incredibly complex emotions as they glanced at the MX Mecha that was now standing up on its own, basking in the feeling of being parents for the first time. Then, they turned their gazes towards the approaching Su Lu and Shang Qiu. These engineers knew very well that if not for these two young technicians, the engineering department would never have been able to complete the MX Mecha research and development so quickly. No one spoke. The spacious underground storeroom was silent. Suddenly, the skylight system above the storeroom switched on, and simulated natural light fell to illuminate the platform above. Under the natural light, the silvery white MX Mecha stood tall on the platform, the firepower system on its left mechanical arm fully engaged. The brand new design of the recirculating main cannon was silently and coldly aimed at the sky. The edges of the wings attached to the mecha's back flowed with eye-catching streamlines, as if in the next moment, this new mecha condensed from more than 10 years of Shell Motor Company's hard work would move. Right then, Su Lo and Shang Qiu had just reached the platform. He looked at Mr. Jose and Zhou Yu, but forgot to shake hands with these important people. Mr. Jose looked at the two young people in front of him with a complicated expression, suddenly feeling that he was the luckiest supervisor in the history of Shell Motor Company. A few years ago, he had discovered a genius like Shang Qiu in the engineering department, and then the heavens had delivered a freak like Su Lu to him. He nodded his head slightly. No one knew which engineers suddenly clapped, but the sound of clapping soon followed. Like the heavy rain that had just begun to fall that night, the clapping grew louder and louder, more and more urgent. It was as if the rain was getting heavier and heavier, roaring and howling, washing away all the gloominess of the world, leaving behind only the refreshing and clean sky. The thunderous applause rang out, echoing throughout the spacious underground storeroom. Even the CEO and the director of the Ministry of National Defense's General Assembly base began to smile and clap. Countless gazes turned to Su Lu and Shang Qiu. Countless claps were either for them or for themselves. The engineers were excited and rejoicing. They knew that the greatest contributors to the success of the MX Mecha's development were these two young people. Su Lu and Shang Qiu glanced at each other, and then their lips split into a childlike grin. The MX Mecha developed by the engineering department had passed the acceptance test. They had succeeded. The clapping continued for a long time. Some of the engineers' palms were already red from clapping, so they decided to just stomp their feet and kick up a fuss, as if insisting that Su Lu and Shang Qiu say something at this time. They were all technical personnel. Giving the glory to these two young people was equivalent to giving themselves respect. Su Lu looked around, his smile somewhat dazed. He lowered his head clumsily and bowed his thanks in all directions. For the sake of the Federation's new generation of mecha, the Shell Motor Company had begun research more than 10 years ago. Even before that, there had been scholars and experts working hard. The engineers around them had never stopped working, and some of the older experts had even bid farewell to this world during this long process. Every time Su Lu thought of this, he felt that the glory should belong to them, to those who were clapping. This was not a pretense or pretentious sentiment, he truly felt this way. He always felt that he had only solved the last problem. It was like building a skyscraper, the foundation and the body of the building had all been built by the predecessors. He had only built the last floor, yet he had to enjoy the applause and respect of so many people. He felt a little embarrassed. "You are really amazing." Su Lu forced himself to calm the excitement in his heart and looked at Shang Qiu beside him seriously. A young girl actually being able to complete the assembly design of a twin engine, if one had to say who was the biggest contributor, it should be Shang Qiu beside him. "I know that I am amazing in this area." Shang Qiu replied with a smile, but the two hands in her sleeves were already clenched into fists. Facing such a scene, how could she, who had dedicated all of her youth to this project, not be excited? Just like Su Lu, she bowed to the engineers around her in thanks. Her gray work uniform was still draped over her shoulders, bowing to all directions. When she lowered her head, who knew how many spring ripples were exposed in front of everyone's eyes, but she acted as if she did not know anything. "Oh." Major Lan Xiaolong, who was behind Su Lu, called out softly. The engineers began to whistle, and the warehouse was filled with jubilation. After Shang Qiu stood up, Su Le whispered beside her, "You did that on purpose. I am the supervisor, and I know how hard they have worked these past few years. Since they succeeded today, of course I have to give them some benefits." Shang Qiu beamed and said, "You contributed the most, so do you want me to give you some benefits?" Su Le subconsciously glanced at Shang Qiu's bulging chest and quickly shook his head. Shang Qiu laughed twice, leaned over, stood on her tiptoes, and kissed him hard on the cheek, making a crisp sound. Su Le touched his face and then scratched his head. He knew that this only meant that he was happy and did not mean anything else. However, in the eyes of the engineers around them, it was not just that. Therefore, the whistles became louder, and there were occasional jeers and shouts. The atmosphere in the warehouse suddenly reached a climax. Bai Yulan, who had been keeping his head down, also raised his head at this moment. He gently lit up a cigarette with a smile and gently took a puff. He was a non-smoker, and would only make an exception when he was in an abnormal mood. Amidst the thunderous applause, he quietly thought to himself, when Su Le and Shang Qiu were designing the assembly at the end, he, as the test pilot, had carried out many tests. Could this be considered some contribution to MX? Right at 4:32 p.m. that day, before the results of the joint inspection by the Ministry of Defense and the Shell Motor Company could be reported to the Federation, a headline appeared on the Federation's biggest news bulletin board: Shell Engineering Department's new MX mecha has been successfully developed. The Federation's biggest news bulletin board was called Star's Sky. Every day, countless citizens of the Federation would choose to view or publish real-time news here. The news was divided into countless categories, so the main news section refreshed exceptionally quickly. That single headline was immediately squeezed into a dozen or so pages, and did not attract much attention. However, immediately after, someone reposted the news on a Weibo, pointing out that the new MX mecha from the Shell Engineering Department had passed the joint inspection by the Ministry of Defense and the company's headquarters this afternoon. It wasn't until now that someone noticed this news. At the same time, the previously buried title was reopened by someone. Today, the most discussed topic of the Federation citizens was the Federal Academy of Sciences Purple Sea mecha and the presidential election. The public's passion and understanding of mecha had been aroused to an unprecedented level, so this piece of news instantly garnered the attention of many people and was quickly pinned in red at the top. However, the public did not understand. The Federal Academy of Science had already developed the mecha, so why was the Shell Engineering Department still continuing? There were George Carlin supporters who began to denounce the Federation's government for blocking information and carrying out repetitive construction, wasting the resources provided by the taxpayers. There were also military enthusiasts who began to analyze the deeper meaning behind the Shell Motor Company's actions. However, without seeing pictures and videos, they also did not know what the difference between the Shell Motor Company's MX and the Federal Academy of Sciences Purple Sea was. For a time, the heated discussion about the new Shell Motor Company's mecha continued into the middle of the night. However, most people expressed their lack of understanding towards the matter, and began to doubt or even criticize the Shell Motor Company's intentions. Right at this time, a post titled, "An Open Letter from the Shell Engineers," was placed on the news bulletin board. Like a giant rock falling into water, it stirred up 1,000 ripples.